Orson Pike signed Calder Boone's name on the loan documents at midnight, alone in the back room of the Silver Crossing Bank, while Calder sat beside his dying wife 40 miles away, holding her hand and praying the fever would break. Pike pressed the stamp down hard. He did not hesitate. He did not pour himself a drink after. He simply folded the papers, slid them into his coat pocket, and walked out into the dark Wyoming night, like a man who had just finished ordinary bookkeeping. 3 months later, he handed Calder an eviction notice at the graveside. The dirt on Martha Boone's grave was still loose. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now, because this channel tells the stories that stick with you long after the screen goes dark. Like this one, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Wyoming, 1892, and meet a man who lost everything and the woman who refused to look away. The morning Calder Boone drove his wagon into Silver Crossing, the temperature had dropped to 9 degrees, and one of his rear wheels had a crack running halfway through the spoke. He knew it. He had been nursing that wheel since Laramie, making adjustments every few miles, whispering at it the way a man whispers at a horse that's thinking about going lame. Mara sat on the bench beside him with her arms wrapped around Eli, who had fallen asleep against her shoulder with his mouth open and a wool blanket pulled up to his chin. She was 11 years old, and she had not complained once since they left Red Mesa. Not when the food ran low. Not when the cold got bad enough that their breath hung in clouds inside the wagon bed. Not even when she overheard Calder talking to himself in the dark, those first nights after they left, working through numbers that no longer added up, no matter how many times he ran them. She was 11 years old, and she understood, in the particular way children understand things they are not supposed to know, that her father was barely holding on. Calder guided the team down the main road of Silver Crossing without looking left or right. He had been here twice before, years ago, when Red Mesa was running strong, and he had come to settle contracts with a cattle buyer named Hendricks. He remembered thinking Silver Crossing was a decent enough town. Hardworking people, honest commerce, a community that judged a man by what he built. He was about to discover how fast that judgment shifts when a man stops building. The wheel cracked through completely 3 blocks from the main square. The wagon lurched hard to the right. Eli woke up with a yelp. Mara grabbed his arm before he could tumble. Calder hauled back on the reins and the team stopped, blowing hard, and he sat there for a moment with his jaw tight, looking down at the collapsed wheel, calculating what it would cost to fix it and what it would cost him to stand in this unfamiliar street and ask for help. He chose the wheel over his pride. He climbed down and started unloading the tools he would need. 2 men across the street stopped to watch. They did not offer assistance. They leaned against the post office railing, with their hands in their coat pockets, and one of them said something to the other, and both of them laughed. Calder heard it. He kept working. A boy maybe Eli's age came close enough to stare at Eli's boots. They were patched at the toe with a strip of leather Calder had cut from an old harness and stitched on himself by firelight. The boy pointed at them. He said something to a girl beside him. She covered her mouth when she giggled. Eli looked down at his own feet. Then he looked up at his father. Calder said, without stopping what he was doing, "Don't pay attention to that." "I'm not," Eli said. But his voice was small, and Calder heard it. He worked for the better part of an hour on that wheel in the cold, while townspeople moved around him like water around a stone. He had no money for a blacksmith. He had the tools in his wagon, the knowledge in his hands, and the refusal to let his children watch him stop. He found a piece of salvageable timber in the wagon bed, shaped it rough, and fashioned a brace that would hold the wheel long enough to get them to proper shelter. It was not elegant work, but it held. He was tightening the final bolt when he heard the laughter again, louder this time. He looked up. There were 4 men now along the far walkway, watching him the way men watch a circus animal. One of them, a heavy-set fellow with a red beard who Calder didn't recognize, called out across the street. "Heard you used to run Red Mesa, Boone." Calder said nothing. Funny how a man can have 15 years of cattle work behind him and still end up fixing a broken wagon in somebody else's street. The man grinned at his companions. "What happened? Did your ranch just walk away from you?" More laughter. A woman came out of the general store, looked at the scene, and walked back inside without a word. Calder set down the wrench. He straightened up slowly. He was a big man, not in the way of extra weight, but in the way of someone who had spent 15 years doing physical labor, and when he turned around fully, the red-bearded man's grin flickered. Calder looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned back to the wheel and picked up the wrench again. "Papa," Mara said quietly from the wagon bench. "I heard you," he said. "We're almost done." He finished the repair, and they drove to the far edge of the square where there was an open space beside a water trough. He paid a boy 2 cents, the last 2 cents he had to carry water for the horses, and then he sat on the wagon step and looked at his hands. Mara climbed down and sat beside him. Eli stood at the horses' heads, talking to them the way Calder had taught him, keeping them calm. "What do we do now?" Mara asked. Calder thought about that question very carefully before he answered it, because she deserved a real answer. "I find work," he said. "Any work. And then tomorrow we do it again." She looked at him. "That's not a plan." "No," he said, "but it's a start." He found his first job within the hour. A man named Garvey, who ran the feed store, needed someone to unload a delivery of hay bales that had arrived that morning. He offered Calder $1 and a sack of flour. Calder said yes before the sentence was finished. He worked for 3 hours straight, moving bales twice his weight, while Mara sat inside the wagon reading to Eli from the one book they had brought, a battered copy of a livestock almanac, which was not exactly children's literature. But Mara read it to him like a story anyway, making up voices for different cattle breeds. And Eli laughed in a way that Calder could hear even through the walls of the feed store, and that sound kept him moving. When Garvey paid him and gave him the flour, he also handed Calder half a cold meat pie from his lunch pail. "Kids eat that," Garvey said, already walking away, in the gruff tone of a man who doesn't want to be thanked. Calder stood there holding the pie for a second. "Thank you," he called after him. Garvey waved a hand without turning around. That one gesture, the unsentimental kindness of a working man who helped because it was the right thing, not because he wanted anything back, kept Calder from doing something dark with his thoughts that night. He had been close, those past weeks, to the kind of thinking that leads nowhere good. Cold and the humiliation and the particular weight of watching his children go without had pushed him toward it more than once. He ate nothing that evening and gave both children the pie and most of the jerky he had left. He told them he wasn't hungry. Mara looked at him the way she had started looking at him lately, like she was adding things up that she didn't want to say out loud. They slept in the wagon under every blanket they owned. It was the coldest night yet. In the morning, Calder went looking for more work. He found it in pieces. A widow named Hartley needed firewood split. A livery stable owner needed 2 stalls mucked. A man whose last name he never caught paid him 40 cents to help move furniture into a house 2 streets over. None of it was enough. All of it was something. The days started forming a kind of rhythm, not a comfortable rhythm, not the rhythm of a man building something, but the grinding rhythm of a man refusing to stop. He asked for work. He did the work. He got paid what he was offered and did not argue. He brought the money back to the wagon, and they ate. He never went to the saloon. He never spent a cent on himself. He fixed the wagon wheel properly as soon as he had enough to pay a blacksmith, because a broken wheel was a liability he could not afford. Some of the townspeople were decent enough. Garvey gave him odd jobs twice a week and never made a production of it. The widow Hartley asked him back 3 times and left coffee on the porch. A Mexican rancher named Delgado, who ran a small spread south of town, hired him for 2 half-days of fence work without asking a single question about where Calder had come from or what had happened to him. Most of the others were not decent. There was a particular group of men who seemed to take personal satisfaction in the fall of Calder Boone. They congregated outside the Silver Crossing Bank on weekday mornings, prosperous men who had done well in the cattle years and wanted everyone to know it. They had dealings with Orson Pike. They considered Pike a shrewd businessman and a community leader, and they took the story of Red Mesa Ranch as Pike had told it as evidence that Calder was simply a man who could not manage what he had been given. Calder heard the version of his own story that circulated through Silver Crossing, and it made him sick in a way that had nothing to do with his empty stomach. In Pike's version, Calder had borrowed heavily against Red Mesa in the lean years after Martha got sick, had failed to meet his payments, had tried to sell off livestock to cover the gap but moved too slowly, and ultimately had lost the ranch through his own financial mismanagement. The bank had been patient. Pike had been nothing but a business partner who saw an investment opportunity in the foreclosure sale. It was a hard story, Pike's people said, but not an uncommon one. A grieving man, a difficult season, poor decisions. The version made Calder's hands go cold every time he heard a piece of it, because parts of it were almost true. He had borrowed against the ranch when Martha got sick, because the medical costs were crushing, and he would have burned the ranch to the ground before he let her go without care. He had struggled with payments during the cattle price drop. He had been slow to act in those weeks when she was dying, because he could not split his attention between the ranch ledgers and his wife's bedside, and he had chosen her without hesitation. What had not happened, what could not have happened, based on every number he could pull from memory, was the size of the debt Pike claimed. Calder had borrowed against the ranch 3 times. He knew the amounts. He knew the terms. He had paid down significant portions before the crisis hit. The debt Pike produced when the bank called the note was nearly double what Calder had actually signed for. He had said so at the time. He had demanded to see the original documents. The bank manager, a thin man named Aldous who sweated even in winter, had shown him papers bearing his own signature and the signatures of 2 witnesses he had never met. Calder had no copies of the originals. He had never thought to keep copies. You didn't think that way about a man you'd worked beside for 7 years. So he had lost his ranch, and now he repaired wagon wheels in other people's streets while men laughed. He was in the middle of that particular wheel repair, the second one, not the first, 3 weeks after arriving in Silver Crossing when the woman came. He had taken on the job for a freight operator named Jessup, who needed 2 wheels pulled and remounted before a supply run the next morning. Jessup was paying him in groceries rather than cash, which Calder had accepted, because the grocery value was better. He was on his knees in the cold, tools spread around him on a canvas, concentrating on the work with the focused blankness of a man who has learned to quiet his thoughts by keeping his hands busy. He heard a carriage stop. He heard the sound of a woman's boots on the frozen ground, precise and unhurried. He felt someone standing behind him. He kept working. Then, from across the street, Calder heard the red-bearded man's voice. He knew it now. The man's name was Connell. He was a cattle broker with money and very little else, and Connell was laughing at something with the men around him, and Calder caught his own name in the laughter. Boone, on his knees again, he did not look up. He kept his jaw locked and his hands moving. The woman standing behind him said, in a voice that was neither loud nor particularly warm, but had the quality of someone accustomed to being heard, "How much is he paying you for that job?" Calder stopped. He looked over his shoulder. She was dressed in deep green wool, well-fitted, practical in the way of someone who spent actual time outdoors rather than merely dressing for appearance. Dark hair caught under a plain hat, no excessive jewelry. She was watching him, with an expression he couldn't immediately read, not pity, which he had learned to identify instantly and despised, and not the cold assessment of someone calculating his usefulness. Something more direct than either. "Groceries," he said. "Good value. For 2 wheels remounted?" Jessup and I agreed on it. "Jessup is getting a very good deal," she said. Calder turned back to the wheel. "Then I'll know better next time." There was a pause. "My name is Lenora Ashcombe," she said. "I own Hawthorne Ridge, north of town. I need fence work done. A week of it, probably more. I pay cash wages, $8 a week." Calder's hands stilled on the wheel. $8 a week was actual money. Not generous by ranch standards, but real. Enough to move off the idea of sleeping in the wagon before one of the children got sick from the cold. Stood up. He was taller than she was by a fair amount, and he noticed that this did not cause her to step back. She simply looked up at him steadily. "Charity," he said. Not a question. "Wages," she said. "Difference being?" "Charity is what I'd give a man I felt sorry for. Wages are what I'd give a man who can do the work. My south fence line has been losing cattle for 2 seasons. I need someone who understands what they're doing, not someone I've hired on sympathy." She glanced at Jessup's wagon and then back at him. "Can you do the work or not?" Calder studied her. She did not look away. From across the street, Connell's laughter came again. Something about Boone being so broke a widow had to come rescue him. Calder saw Lenora's jaw tighten slightly, just slightly, like someone who had heard that sort of thing before and had learned not to give it the satisfaction of a visible reaction. I have 2 children, Calder said. I know. They go where I go. I have a foreman's cottage that's been empty for 8 months, she said. It has a stove and 2 bedrooms and the roof is sound. Calder said nothing for a long moment. He thought about Mara's face that morning when she woke up in the wagon and her breath had fogged in the cold air inside it. He thought about the way Eli had stopped asking when they were going home, because he had figured out that asking made his father's face do something that scared him. I finished this job first, Calder said. I gave Jessup my word. Something shifted in Lenora's expression. Barely. But he caught it. When will you be done? 2 hours. I'll be at the dry goods store, she said. Come find me when you're finished. She walked away without ceremony, and Calder watched her go for a moment, then turned back to the wheel. He finished the job in 1 hour and 40 minutes. The foreman's cottage smelled like dust and old wood, and something faintly sweet that turned out to be dried lavender in a bundle over the kitchen window, left there by some previous occupant who had liked the smell. Mara stood in the doorway of the smaller bedroom and did not speak for a long time. Eli pushed past her and sat on the edge of one of the beds and bounced twice to test the mattress. It's real, he announced, as if he'd needed to verify it. Calder stood in the middle of the main room with his hat in his hands. Looking at the stove that was already laid with wood, Lenora had sent one of her ranch hands ahead to light it, and at the 2 real bedrooms, and at the window with the lavender, and at the table where 4 chairs stood, one more than they needed, and he breathed in through his nose and held it. There's a barn cat, Eli said from the window. I can see it from here. It's orange. Don't bother the barn cat, Calder said automatically. I'm not going to bother it. I'm going to make friends with it. Mara came out of the bedroom. Her face was very controlled, which was the way she had learned to keep herself level, because she had watched her father keeping himself level and had imitated him without knowing she was doing it. We're staying here, she said. For now, Calder said. I'm working Hawthorne Ridge. We'll stay as long as the work lasts. And if it runs out, then I find more work. Mara looked at him for a moment. Then she said, She seems like a decent person. She seems like a businesswoman, Calder said. Which is better. Decent people are nice to you. Businesswomen pay you. Mara almost smiled at that. Almost. She went back to the bedroom to unpack the 1 bag she owned, which she did with the same careful efficiency she brought to everything, folding each item twice before placing it, making a home out of what she had. Calder sat down in one of the chairs at the table and looked at his hands. He had started working for a stranger because he had no other real choice. He told himself that was all it was. A practical transaction between 2 people who both needed something the other could provide. He told himself that very firmly. Then he got up and went to find out what kind of shape Hawthorne Ridge's south fence was actually in. It was worse than Lenora had described. She walked him out to the south pasture the morning after he arrived, and they stood at the first line of fencing in a silence that stretched long enough to be respectful. 3 sections had rotted through at the posts. 2 more were leaning at angles that would not survive another hard wind. The wire was rusted, and in several places had been twisted back rather than properly repaired, which told Calder that whoever had tried to maintain it hadn't known what they were doing or hadn't cared. Cattle losses, he said. Through this section? Mostly, Lenora said. I've had 3 animals get into the north timber and not come back, and 2 more ended up on Delgado's property last spring. He returned them, but he was not particularly happy about it. No, Calder said. He wouldn't be. He walked along the fence line, pressing a gloved hand against the posts one by one, testing their resistance. Most of them gave too much. This wasn't neglected recently. This has been going bad for years. Your foreman, before how long was he here? 4 years. He didn't report this? Lenora looked at the fence. No. What happened to him? He left to work for the Hendricks operation south of the divide. More money. Calder turned back to the fence. He could feel her waiting for him to say something about the former foreman's incompetence or negligence, the kind of editorial commentary that employees sometimes offer to curry favor. He did not offer it. I'll need posts, he said. Good ones, not green timber. Wire, staples, a proper tamping bar. I can build you a list today and price it. I've already ordered supplies from the hardware store. They should arrive day after tomorrow. He looked at her. What kind of posts? She told him. They were the right kind. He said so. You know fence work, she said. I ran a cattle operation for 15 years. Yes. She nodded once, in the way of someone who already knew that and was confirming something else. I'll leave you to assess the rest of the line. Come to the main house this evening and tell me what you need. She walked back toward the house, and he watched her go for a moment, noting the way she moved across rough terrain without adjusting her pace for it. Someone who had been working this land herself for a while, not just administering it. He turned back to the fence. He worked the entire south line that day, walking every foot of it, testing every post, making notes on a scrap of paper with a pencil stub. When he came back to the cottage that evening, Eli was at the kitchen table drawing something on the back of an old envelope. Mara had cooked. She had found potatoes and onions and a heel of smoked ham in the basket. Lenora had left on their step that morning a basket that contained food and nothing else, no note. No gesture that could be called charity, and she had made something that actually smelled like a meal. Calder sat down, and they ate at a real table for the first time in over 2 months. Eli talked for most of it. He had spent the afternoon introducing himself to Hawthorne Ridge in the systematic way of a 7-year-old who believed all animals were potential friends and all refusals to engage were merely the animals being too polite to say yes yet. He had established contact with the orange barn cat, who was named, according to a ranch hand he'd spoken to, nothing at all. Eli was going to fix that. His name is Marshall, Eli announced. Cat, Mara said. The cat's name is Marshall. You cannot name someone else's cat. He doesn't have a name. So he's not someone else's named cat. He's just someone else's cat. And I named him. Eli considered this logic airtight. Calder ate and listened and felt something release in his chest that had been locked since March. The next morning he went to the main house at first light to give Lenora his assessment, and she answered the door herself in a work coat, not a formal visiting dress, which confirmed what he had already suspected, that she ran this ranch from inside it, not from behind a desk. He gave her the complete report on the fence line. All of it, including the section in the northwest corner that she apparently had not known about, where a creek had been slowly undermining a post line and had already collapsed one full section into the mud. She listened without interrupting him. When he was done, she said, "That's more than I thought." "Yes. How long for all of it?" 3 weeks if I work straight. 2.5 if I have help for the heavy posts. I can give you a hand for the posts. One of my ranch hands, Torres. He's steady. Fine. She looked at the list in his hand. What else did you notice? He hesitated. That's outside the fence line. I'm asking what else you noticed. He looked at her. She was not asking to be polite. She was asking because she actually wanted to know. And there was a quality in that directness that he had not encountered in Silver Crossing from anyone except Garvey, who communicated mostly through grunts. Your cattle, he said. The herd I saw in the north pasture. At least 4 of those animals need attention. One looks like she's carrying too much weight on her front left. 2 others are showing coat issues that could be early nutritional deficiency. And one of the bulls, Copper? I don't know his name. The dark red one. That's Copper. He's got something going on around his left eye. Could be nothing. Could be the start of an infection. Needs a look from someone who knows cattle medicine. Lenora was quiet for a moment. I had a man looking after the cattle care when Chester, my foreman, was still here. When Chester left, the man left with him. You haven't replaced him. I've been interviewing. You've been managing it yourself in the meantime. She looked at him steadily. Is that a question? No, he said. It's an observation that you're managing a larger operation than one person should be managing, alone, and doing it without complaining about it. Something crossed her face that he couldn't entirely name, not surprise. Exactly, but something adjacent to being accurately seen by someone she hadn't expected to be seen by. I can look at the cattle, he said. I'm not a veterinarian, but I've handled enough sick animals to know the difference between something that can be treated and something that needs a professional. That's not what I hired you for. No, but it's what your cattle need. Another pause. I'll pay you for the additional time, she said. You're already paying me fair wages, he said. Check the cattle with me tomorrow morning before I start on the fence and we'll know what we're dealing with. He went back to work. The fence posts arrived on the third day, and he and Torres began the real labor. Torres was a compact, quiet man from somewhere south of the Rio Grande who communicated primarily through the quality of his work, which was extremely high. He and Calder developed an efficient system without much conversation, which suited both of them. In the evenings, Calder cataloged what he found during the day, not just the fence, but everything. He was a man who noticed things, who had spent 15 years reading a landscape the way others read text, and Hawthorne Ridge was speaking to him constantly. The cattle operation had been well designed once, but had drifted. Decisions that Chester had made or failed to make had accumulated into inefficiencies that were costing Lenora real money. The grazing rotation was off. The hay storage was positioned in a way that added unnecessary labor to daily feeding. 3 water troughs in the south pasture had slow leaks that were wasting water and creating mud that the cattle were sinking into and dirtying themselves in unnecessarily. He did not report all of this at once. He mentioned things when they were relevant, when he had a concrete suggestion rather than just a criticism, and he kept his observations to what he had actually examined rather than speculating. Lenora listened. She did not always agree. When she didn't agree, she said so directly and explained why, and twice she was right, and he said so. And once he was right, and she acknowledged it without making a ceremony of it. By the end of the first week, the south fence line's worst sections were rebuilt, and 3 of the most critical cattle issues had been addressed. Copper's eye turned out to be a minor irritation that cleared with treatment. Cow with a compromised front leg needed to be separated and rested, and the nutritional issue was a simple feed adjustment. Lenora stopped by the fence on a Friday afternoon to check the progress. She walked the rebuilt section, testing posts the same way Calder did, pushing against them to feel for movement. This is good work, she said. The wood's right, he said. Good posts make the rest easier. She turned to look at him. Calder. It was the first time she had used his first name. He noticed it. I heard what Connell said when I spoke to you in town, she said. That day at the wagon. About me coming to rescue you. He kept his hands on the wire he was running. I heard it too. Does it bother you? Working here after that? He thought about it honestly, which was the only way he knew how to think. It bothers me that people talk, he said. Doesn't bother me that you offered work. You explained the difference between the two clearly enough. I meant what I said, she said. This isn't charity. I know, he looked at her directly. The south fence is proof of that. No one hires someone on charity and then gives them 3 weeks of back-breaking post work. She almost laughed. It was a small thing, brief, controlled, but he caught it. She walked back toward the house. He watched her go, the way he had been watching her go for a week now, not with intention, just with the particular attentiveness of a man who has been numb for months and is slowly becoming aware that the numbness is not total. He turned back to the fence. He did not think about it again that evening. He tried not to anyway. It was Mara who found the box. Calder had kept most of his important documents in a wooden box he had built himself when Red Mesa was new, a tight-fitted pine chest with a brass latch, about the size of a ledger book, that lived under the main bed in the ranch house. When Pike's men came to take the property, Calder had grabbed the box, along with the children's clothes and the family photograph and his tools. He had not known why. He had not been thinking clearly enough to know why. He had only known it was important. The box had lived under the cottage bed for 3 weeks without being opened. On a Sunday afternoon, when Calder was out in the barn with Torres working on a gate mechanism, Mara went looking for her pencil, which she thought might have rolled under the bed. She found the pencil. She also pulled out the box. She had seen it before. She had never opened it. It had always been one of those things that existed at the edge of her awareness as something belonging to her father's private grief, the proof of everything that had happened, the paperwork of their loss, and she had not wanted to look at it. That afternoon she opened it. Inside were receipts, bank slips, livestock sale records, pages of ledger entries in her father's handwriting, contracts, several letters. She started reading. She was 11 years old, but she had taught self-accounting from the livestock almanac and from watching her father work, and she understood numbers in the practical way of a child who has been paying attention to how money actually flows. It took her 40 minutes of quiet, careful reading to find the problem. She brought the box to the barn. Calder was on his back under the gate frame, with his hands deep in a hinge mechanism when she appeared in the doorway. "Papa." Something in her voice made him come out from under the gate immediately. She held the box. "I opened it," she said. "I'm sorry. I was looking for my pencil, and it was there, and I—" "It's all right," he said. "What did you find?" She set the box on a workbench and spread out 3 documents side by side. Her finger moved between them with the same careful precision she used when she was explaining something she wanted to get exactly right. "This one," she said, pointing to a livestock sale receipt dated February of 1891, "shows you sold 40 head for—" She read the number carefully, $720. "And you applied it to the cattle loan. There's a note here in your writing." "I remember that sale," Calder said. "This one," she pointed to the bank payment record, "shows a payment received of $720 against the cattle loan. Same date." "And this one," she said, very quietly, placing her finger on a 3rd document, "is from the foreclosure notice. It's a list of the debts against the ranch, and the cattle loan, the one you paid that $720 against, is listed here as if you never made that payment." Silence in the barn. Torres had gone still near the gate without looking at them. Calder looked at the 3 documents. He picked up the payment record and looked at it closely. The date, the amount, the partial account number, visible at the top. "Payment recorded here," he said slowly. "The account number." "It doesn't match the loan account number on the foreclosure notice," Mara said. "I checked it 3 times. Calder set the paper down. He looked at his daughter. She was watching him with those 11-year-old eyes that had been too old for a year now. "There's more," she said. "I found 2 other payments where the numbers are different. And there's a livestock sale record, the spring herd, 60 animals that isn't listed anywhere in the debt documents at all. Like those animals never existed." Calder sat down on the workbench. He sat there for a long time. 60 head from the spring sale. 2 misapplied payments, $720, that should have reduced a debt that had appeared, fully intact, on a foreclosure notice. He had not imagined the numbers being wrong. He had told Aldous at the bank that the debt was too large, and Aldous had shown him papers with his own signature, and Calder had trusted the paper over his own memory, because he had been barely sleeping and barely eating, and his wife had been dead. For 3 months, and he had not been capable of the clear-eyed arithmetic he was capable of now. The ranch had not been taken from him because he failed. The ranch had been taken from him because someone had made sure he would fail. "Papa," Mara said. He realized he was gripping the edge of the workbench hard enough to whiten his knuckles. He let go. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked, opening the box. "No," he said. He looked at her. "You did something right. Something very right." He paused. "How long ago did your mother teach you to read a ledger?" Mara blinked. "She didn't. You did. You used to let me sit with the ranch books when I was little, and you'd explain what everything meant." Calder stared at his daughter. He had not remembered that. He had done it without thinking, the way parents do things without knowing they're teaching anything, just letting a curious child sit beside him while he worked, answering questions because she asked them. And now those lessons were sitting in front of him in the form of 3 receipts that might take everything back. "Don't say anything about this yet," he said, "to anyone. Not even Eli. Eli can't keep a secret," Mara said immediately. "No, he cannot." Calder began carefully returning the documents to the box. "I need to think, and I need to talk to someone who understands what we're looking at." Close the box. He picked it up and held it for a moment, the weight of 15 years of paper and numbers, and a life that had been taken from him fitting neatly in both hands. Tomorrow, he thought, he was going to have a very difficult conversation. And for the first time in months, the thought of a difficult conversation did not fill him with dread. It filled him with something that felt cautiously and not entirely comfortably, like the beginning of anger, the clean, clear, productive kind of anger that doesn't destroy things but builds them instead. He did not sleep that night. He lay on the narrow cottage bed, staring at the ceiling while the stove ticked and cooled, and the wind came off the mountains in slow, heavy waves, and he ran numbers in his head the way he had run them 100 times in the worst weeks after losing Red Mesa. But this time the numbers were different. This time they added up to something other than defeat. Spring herd, 60 animals. He had sold them through a buyer in Cheyenne named Burgess who ran legitimate livestock auctions and kept clean records. The sale had netted him $1,140, which he had brought back in a bank draft and deposited directly against the primary ranch loan. He remembered the transaction, exactly remembered the drive to Cheyenne, remembered the weather that week, remembered Burgess shaking his hand and saying the animals were well conditioned, remembered the bank draft folded in his breast pocket on the ride home, remembered handing it across the counter to a clerk at the Silver Crossing Bank, whose name he did not know because it had not mattered at the time. It mattered now. He also remembered the two smaller payments. Mara had found the payments where the account numbers didn't align with the foreclosure records. He had made those payments in person, at the bank, in cash, in the presence of Pike himself, who had stood beside him at the counter in that early period when they were still partners, and the crisis was just beginning to show its shape. Pike had been there. He had watched Calder hand over the money. He had nodded at the teller. He had known then exactly what he was watching. Calder turned onto his side and looked at the wall. He thought about what it meant to prove something like this. He was a broke cowboy sleeping in a borrowed cottage on a woman's charity, her wages. He corrected himself automatically. Her wages with 2 children, and no powerful name and no attorney, and the full weight of Silver Crossing's opinion against him. Pike had friends in this town. Pike had the bank. Pike had the story. Calder had a wooden box full of receipts and a daughter who was better with numbers than anyone gave her credit for. He got up before dawn, started the stove, and sat at the kitchen table with the box open in front of him. He spread everything out in order, dates on the left, amounts in the middle, account numbers and references on the right. He worked through it methodically, without rushing, the way he had learned to work through problems too large to solve all at once, by breaking them into the parts you can actually hold. By the time pale light was coming through the window, he had a clear picture. It was worse than Mara had found, and it was better, because worse meant there was more evidence. 3 payments misapplied, 1 major sale, the spring herd, that appeared nowhere in the debt documents, and 1 item he had not noticed the night before, a loan origination date on one of the foreclosure documents that was 6 weeks earlier than the date on the original loan contract he had signed. A 6-week gap that meant the interest calculations would be off. Substantially off, in Pike's favor. He sat back in his chair. He was not a lawyer. He did not know how courts worked, or what constituted legal proof of fraud, or what the territorial rules were around bank documentation. He knew cattle. He knew land. He knew numbers. But he knew someone who might know the rest. He waited until 7 o'clock, then went to the main house and knocked. Lenora answered the door in her work coat, with coffee in one hand, and a look that said she had been up for some time already. She took in his expression. "Come in," she said, without asking what was wrong. He sat at her kitchen table, a bigger table than the cottage's, covered at one end with ledger books and correspondence she had apparently been working through before he arrived, and he laid out the documents without preamble. "My daughter found these," he said, "in a box I've had since before we left Red Mesa. I need you to look at them." She set her coffee down and looked. She did not speak while she read. She turned each page carefully, going back twice to compare entries. And she had the same quality of focus that Calder had noticed in her, before the ability to be completely still when something required her full attention. No fidgeting, no noise, just the work. It took her 15 minutes. When she finished, she straightened the papers into a neat stack and looked up at him. "The Springard sale," she said. "Do you have anything from the buyer in Cheyenne?" The name was Burgess. He ran an auction house on the north end of the city. I had a receipt from him, but it was in the ranch house when we left. Couldn't find it in the time we had. But the sale went through a bank draft? Yes. Then there's a record of it somewhere, she said. The bank would have logged the draft. Burgess would have issued a receipt. The Cheyenne auction registry keeps transaction records. She looked at the loan origination date. This discrepancy here, 6 weeks. Do you remember when you actually signed the original loan? April 14th. 1,889, Calder said. I remember it because it was 2 days after Eli's birthday, and I was still feeling guilty about leaving for town. And this document shows origination in early March of that year. Yes. Lenora looked at the document for another moment. If the origination date is fraudulent, the entire interest calculation for the life of the loan is wrong. The amount you supposedly owed would be inflated by months of compounding interest you never actually incurred. That was my reading of it, he said. I'm not a banker. Neither am I, she said. But I've managed the Hawthorne Ridge finances alone for 3 years, and I know what a manipulated interest calculation looks like. She put the document down. Calder, if these records are accurate, and I think they are, because the account number discrepancies alone are not something a man invents in his memory, you may not have legally lost your ranch. I know, he said. She heard something in his voice that made her look at him more carefully. How long have you suspected? She asked. Since the day they handed me the foreclosure notice, he said. I told Aldous at the bank the debt was wrong. He showed me papers, and I had nothing to contradict them. He stopped. Started again. I was not in a clear state of mind. My wife had been dead 3 months, and I had 2 children, and I couldn't think straight enough to fight it the way it needed to be fought. Lenora was quiet. Pike knew that, Calder said. It was not a guess. It was the thing he had been sitting with all night. The part of this that was not about numbers or documents, but about a man who had been his partner for 7 years, timing the execution of a fraud to the weeks when Calder would be least able to defend himself. He waited. He was patient. He let me borrow against the ranch while Martha was sick, because that gave him the documentation he needed, and then he waited until she was gone, and I was buried in grief, and he moved. He said it without particular emotion, which was the only way he could say it. The emotion was there. It was very large and very controlled, like something in a pen that could break through if you let it. Lenora looked at him for a moment. What do you want to do? I want my ranch back, he said, and I want to do it without spending money I don't have on attorneys I can't afford. What does that look like? It looks like gathering every piece of evidence that exists in this territory and making a case that cannot be argued with. He met her eyes. I know what I'm asking. You've already given me work and shelter. I'm not asking for your money or your connections. But you know people in this valley that I don't know, and you've been here long enough to understand how things move. I could use, he stopped, because asking for help was still not easy and probably never would be. Advice, she said. Yes. She reached for her coffee and drank from it and looked at the documents on the table. Aldous, she said. The bank manager. What about him? He's not a dishonest man. She said this carefully, like someone making a precise distinction. He's a weak one. There's a difference. Dishonest men take pleasure in the deception. Aldous sweats through his collar at town meetings and looks at the floor when certain people are mentioned. He's the kind of man who lets things happen because stopping them requires a courage he doesn't have, not because he actually wants them to happen. Calder thought about Aldous showing him the papers. The way he had not quite met Calder's eyes, the way his hands had moved too quickly, putting the documents away. You think he knows, Calder said. I think he has known from the start and has been living with it, Lenora said. Which means he is not your enemy. He might be your only witness inside that bank. He won't talk willingly. No. But a man carrying that kind of weight for 2 years is looking for somewhere to set it down. You just have to give him a safe place to set it. She paused. Not a confrontation, not an accusation, a conversation. Calder looked at her. You've done this kind of thing before. I've managed difficult people in difficult situations without the benefit of a husband to do it for me for 3 years, she said. You learn things. He gathered the documents and returned them to the box. I'm going to keep working the fence, he said. I'm not stopping the work to chase this. Why not? Because if I chase this publicly and it falls apart, I've got nothing left here. The work is real. The fence gets rebuilt either way. He picked up the box. And I don't want Pike to hear that Calder Boone is making accusations before I have something solid enough to back it up. Lenora looked at him with an expression he was beginning to recognize, the one where she was recalibrating something about him, adding a piece to a picture she was building. That's patient thinking for an angry man, she said. I've had practice, he said. He went back to work. Torres was already at the northwest corner when Calder arrived, tamping a new post into frozen ground with the steady, economical efficiency that characterized everything the man did. They worked in near silence for 3 hours, and Calder was grateful for it, grateful for the physical weight of the work, the posts and wire and cold air that required his hands and kept the anger in its pen. At mid-morning, a rider came along the ridge road heading toward Silver Crossing. Calder watched him without appearing to watch. He didn't recognize the horse, and then the rider turned in the saddle to look at the fence work, and Calder recognized the rider. It was one of Pike's men, a younger fellow, blond, who ran errands between Pike's new operation and the town. He had seen him twice at the feed store. The man looked at Calder for a moment longer than was casual. Then he rode on. Calder drove a staple into a post with 3 clean strikes and said nothing. Torres said, without looking up from his work, "That man was here yesterday, too." On the south road. Calder looked at him. Torres shrugged, a small, precise movement. "Thought you should know." "Thank you," Calder said. He worked through the afternoon with that information sitting at the back of his mind. Pike was watching Hawthorne Ridge, which meant Pike had heard that Calder was working here, which was inevitable in a town Silver Crossing size, and had decided it warranted watching, which meant Pike was not entirely comfortable. Good. That evening he told Lenora about the rider. She listened without visible reaction. "He's done that before," she said. "Had men ride past after I turned down one of his grazing proposals last year. I think he was checking whether I'd hired anyone he should worry about." "Had you?" Chester wasn't the type to worry about. She refilled her coffee. "You are." Calder didn't know what to do with that, so he moved on. "I need to go into Silver Crossing tomorrow. I want to check on something at the county records office before I approach Aldous." "What are you looking for?" Pike filed the foreclosure through the court. "There should be a recorded copy of all the debt documentation in the county registry. The documents on file don't match what's in this box. That's not my word against his. That's a public record." Lenora set her coffee down. "I'll drive you in. You don't need to. You don't have a horse," she said. "And arriving at the county records office in your own wagon, which still has a cracked spoke. By the way, I noticed it this afternoon is not the impression you want to make." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not rescuing you. I'm providing transportation." He almost said something sharp and self-sufficient. He stopped himself. "Thank you," he said instead. She nodded as if that had been the only reasonable answer, which it had been. They drove into Silver Crossing the next morning with Mara in the back of the carriage, because Mara had insisted on coming and Calder had found, in the month since they arrived at Hawthorne Ridge, that Mara's insistence on certain things was better respected than argued with. She had his stubbornness without the pride that sometimes made his stubbornness stupid. Eli stayed behind with Torres, who had demonstrated a willingness to tolerate Eli's company that Calder privately found touching. Torres did not talk much to adults, but he answered every single one of Eli's approximately 400 daily questions with patient, brief, accurate answers, and Eli had decided Torres was among the greatest men alive. County Records Office was a narrow building beside the courthouse, run by a clerk named Foss, who was old enough to remember when the territory was organized, and who treated every document in his care with the reverence of a man who understood that paper outlasted people. Calder explained what he was looking for. Foss looked at him over his spectacles for a long moment, then looked at Lenora, then back at Calder. "Boone," he said. "Red Mesa Ranch." "Yes." "Foreclosure filed November of 1891. "Yes." Foss went into the back room and came out 20 minutes later with a ledger and 3 folded documents. He spread them on the counter with care. Calder looked at the first document. It was the loan agreement. The origination date showed March 7th, 1889. He put his hand flat on the counter to keep it from doing anything visible. March 7th, not April 14th. The fraudulent date was in the official county record. He looked at Lenora. She was already looking at him. "Can I see the collateral documentation?" he asked Foss. Foss turned to the ledger and pointed to an entry. Calder read it. The collateral list for the primary loan included the spring cattle herd, 60 head as security. He pulled from his coat the livestock almanac page where Mara had copied down the key entries from his receipts the night before, in her careful 11-year-old handwriting. He held the page next to the county document. The spring herd was listed as collateral in the county record dated February 1890. The sale of that same herd to Burgess and Cheyenne had taken place in March 1890. A month after it was pledged as collateral on a loan, it had been sold. The proceeds had been applied to the debt, but the county record showed no notation of the sale or the payment, which meant that Pike had used cattle as collateral, collected the sale proceeds after Calder applied them to the debt, and then continued to list the unpaid value of that collateral against the loan, as if the sale had never happened and the payment had never been made. It was not complicated fraud. It was patient, thorough, and it required access to the bank's internal records, which meant someone inside the bank had helped. Aldous, who sweated at town meetings and looked at the floor. Calder thanked Foss, who folded the documents back with the same careful reverence with which he'd unfolded them and asked no questions. Because Foss had been a county clerk for 30 years and had learned that the documents told the story without any help from him. They walked back to the carriage in silence. Mara had waited outside on the step, and she fell into step beside them without asking what they'd found, reading her father's posture the way she read everything. Lenora drove them 3 blocks before she said anything. Pike had help inside the bank, she said. Yes, Aldous. Has to be. Or a clerk who reported to Aldous. Either way, Aldous knew. She was quiet for a moment. How do you want to approach him? Carefully, Calder said. Not yet. I need something more from Cheyenne first. If I can get confirmation that the Burgess sale proceeds were transmitted as a bank draft to Silver Crossing Bank, and that draft appears nowhere in the bank's official debt record, that's not a discrepancy I'm pointing to. That's a hole big enough to drive a herd through. You'd need to go to Cheyenne, or Wright. If Burgess is still operating, he keeps records. Auction houses have to, for territorial livestock registry compliance. He thought for a moment. And if the bank draft cleared, there should be a record at the Territorial Banking Commission. Lenora nodded slowly. I can help you write those letters tonight. I know the proper form for a banking commission inquiry. I've made several for Hawthorne Ridge accounts. Mara, from the back of the carriage, said quietly, I can write them. If you tell me what to say. Both adults turned to look at her. Her handwriting is better than mine, Calder said. It's considerably better than mine, Lenora agreed. Mara sat up a little straighter, trying not to look like she was pleased about this. They were halfway back to Hawthorne Ridge when they passed the front of the Silver Crossing Bank, and Orson Pike was standing on its front steps, talking to 2 men Calder didn't recognize. Pike was a large man, broad-shouldered, with the kind of easy authority that came from a decade of having things go his way. He dressed well. He held himself well. He was laughing at something one of the men had said. He saw Calder in the carriage. The laugh didn't stop immediately. Continued for a natural beat, the way a skilled man controls his reactions. Then he turned back to his companions and said something, and one of the men looked at the carriage too. Calder did not look away from Pike. He held the look for the 2 seconds it took for the carriage to move past, and he kept his face completely still, and he let Pike read whatever he wanted to read in it. Then the carriage rolled past, and he faced forward. He saw you, Lenora said. Good, Calder said. They did not discuss it further. That evening, the 3 of them sat at Lenora's kitchen table. Eli had fallen asleep on the cottage floor with the cat, which Mara had reported with the mixture of exasperation and fondness that was her primary mode of relating to her brother, and composed 2 letters. One to Burgess Livestock Auctions in Cheyenne, requesting confirmation of a specific sale transaction from March 1890. One to the Wyoming Territorial Banking Commission, requesting transaction verification for a bank draft of $1,140 transmitted to Silver Crossing Bank in March 1890. Mara wrote them out in her careful, precise hand, slightly formal because she was writing what Lenora dictated, but applying her own sense of order to the sentence structure. Lenora read the finished letters and looked at Mara. You have good instincts for this kind of writing, she said. Mara looked uncertain about how to receive that. I just wrote what you said. You reorganized 2 of the sentences so they were clearer. I noticed. Mara looked at the letters. The original order buried the most important information. Yes, that's what I said. Good instincts. Mara looked at the table. A small color came into her face. Calder watched this exchange and felt something that was not quite happiness. Happiness was too simple a word for what a man feels when his daughter is seen accurately, but was in that neighborhood. He sealed both letters that night and rode into town before dawn to post them, before Silver Crossing was awake, and before Pike's men were watching the Ridge Road. The waiting was the worst part. He had known it would be, and it was. He worked the fence. He helped with the cattle. He fixed the water troughs in the south pasture. He reorganized the hay storage, with Lenora's agreement, which required 2 full days of labor, but solved a problem that had been creating unnecessary work every morning for years. She stood and watched the first morning after the reorganization, when the feeding took 40 minutes instead of an hour and 10, and she said nothing. But she looked at the setup with the expression of someone acknowledging that they had been doing something inefficiently and were genuinely glad it was fixed. He reorganized the grazing rotation. He wrote it out as a schedule and brought it to Lenora and explained his reasoning. And she listened and asked 3 pointed questions and pushed back on one element, the timing of the northeast pasture rotation, which she said had soil conditions he hadn't fully accounted for, and she was right, and they revised it together, and the final version was better than either of them would have produced alone. He noticed that. He noticed other things too, in the way a man notices things he is trying not to notice. The way she came out to the fence line in the afternoons, not to supervise, but because she genuinely wanted to know what was happening on her own land. The way she talked to the horses, not with the baby voice some people used, but with a low, direct conversational tone that assumed the animals were paying attention, which they were. The way she listened when someone was talking truly listened, without preparing her response while you were still speaking, which was rarer than it should have been. And the way she talked to Mara, that was the thing he noticed most, and tried hardest not to let mean too much. Lenora talked to Mara like a person, not like a child to be managed or complimented or kept out of the way, but like someone with a functioning mind who was worth engaging with seriously. She lent Mara books from her study real books, not almanacs, and when Mara returned them, she asked what Mara had thought, and she actually listened to the answer and argued back when she disagreed. And Mara argued back at her, and neither of them seemed troubled by this. He watched his daughter, who had been quiet and too old for a year, begin to have opinions again. Eli, for his part, had entirely colonized Hawthorne Ridge. He had named the barn cat and 2 of the horses, and had given informal names to 4 of the cattle, which was probably inadvisable from a livestock management perspective, but which Torres had not discouraged. Either because he found it useful for identification purposes, or because he lacked the heart to stop a 7-year-old from believing a cow named Henrietta was his personal friend. Lenora had taken Eli riding twice on her gentlest mare. The first time, she had led the mare by hand around the paddock while Eli sat up straight in the saddle, with the focused intensity of someone performing extremely important work. The second time, she had let him hold the reins himself with her walking beside him, close enough to intervene, far enough to let him feel the independence of it. He had come back to the cottage that evening, told Calder, with the absolute certainty of someone who has made a major life decision, that he was going to be a horseman. "I thought you were going to be a cowboy," Calder said. "A horseman is better," Eli said. "Cowboys have to do a lot of walking." Horseman ride. Calder had kept his face straight with some effort. The replies to the letters came in the same post delivery, 12 days after they were sent, on a Tuesday morning, when the first real spring warmth was coming off the mountains. He was at the fence when Mara ran out across the pasture with both envelopes in her hand, her braid coming loose, not walking. He set down the tamping bar and met her halfway. She was breathing hard from running. She held out both envelopes without speaking. He opened the one from Burgess first. Burgess Livestock Auctions confirmed that on March 18th, 1890, they had conducted a sale of 60 head of cattle, presented by Calder Boone of Red Mesa Ranch. Net proceeds of $1,140 had been issued as a bank draft, made payable to Silver Crossing Bank for the account of Calder Boone, for application against an outstanding cattle loan. The draft had been prepared and transmitted on March 20th, $1,890. He opened the second envelope. The Wyoming Territorial Banking Commission confirmed that a bank draft in the amount of $1,140, originating from Burgess Livestock Auctions in Cheyenne, had been received and processed by Silver Crossing Bank on March 24th, $1,890. Both documents folded neatly in his hands. Mara was watching him. "It's there," she said. "It's there," he confirmed. "Does that mean?" "It means the payment was made and received and recorded by the Territorial Commission, and appears in neither the county foreclosure documents nor, presumably, in the bank's debt ledger that Aldous showed me." He looked at his daughter. "It means Pike and Aldous accepted an $1,100 payment against that loan and then foreclosed on the ranch, as if the payment never happened." Mara stood very still in the pasture, with the spring wind moving her loose hair. "That's theft," she said. "Yes," Calder said, "that's exactly what it is." He folded both letters and put them in his coat. Then he looked out across the fence line toward the distant ridge, where, if you knew where to look, you could just see the edge of what had once been Red Mesa's north boundary. He had been patient. He had been quiet. He had fixed another man's fences and kept his head down and swallowed a year's worth of humiliation in small daily doses. And he had done it because he had no other choice, and because his children needed him standing more than they needed him righteous. He had his proof now. Mara said, "What do we do with it?" "We talk to Mrs. Ashcombe," he said, "and then we figure out how to talk to Aldous without giving Pike time to run." They walked back across the pasture together, and for the first time in over a year, the ground under Calder's feet felt like it was going somewhere. He went to the main house and knocked, and Lenora opened the door. She looked at his face, and then at Mara's, and she stood back to let them in without saying anything, which was the right thing to do. He laid both letters on her kitchen table. She read them standing up, which he had noticed she did when something required her immediate full attention, and sitting felt too slow. When she finished, she stood there with both letters in her hands and her eyes on the middle distance, and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Aldous." "Yes. If we approach him wrong, he runs to Pike." "I know. If we approach him right." "He's been carrying this for 2 years, Calder said. You said it yourself. A man carrying that kind of weight is looking for somewhere to set it down. I'm going to give him the letters first, before I say a word. I'm going to let him read what we have, and understand that the documentation already exists outside this county and cannot be made to disappear. And then I'm going to ask him one question." Lenora looked up from the letters. "What question?" she asked. Calder looked at her. "Whether he'd rather be the man who helped cover this up," he said, "or the man who helped uncover it." Lenora was quiet for a long moment. Outside, one of the horses moved in the paddock, a slow shifting sound. The spring light came flat and pale through the kitchen window and caught the edge of the letters in her hands. "When?" she asked. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "before Pike's men are watching the road." She nodded. She set the letters on the table carefully, the way Foss had set the county documents, like someone who understood that paper outlasted people and deserved to be treated accordingly. "I'll have the carriage ready at 5, she said. Calder picked up the letters and folded them back into his coat, beside the copies Mara had made, beside the original receipts from the pine box, beside the page of notes in his daughter's careful handwriting. He had walked into Silver Crossing 2 months ago, with a cracked wagon wheel and 2 frightened children, and the particular hollow feeling of a man who has had everything taken from him and cannot yet see the shape of what comes next. He was walking back in tomorrow with enough paper to take it all back. And this time he was not walking alone. They left Hawthorne Ridge at 5 in the morning, with frost still on the grass and the mountains black against a sky that had not decided yet whether it would be clear or cloudy. Lenora drove. Calder sat beside her with the letters in his coat and the pine box on the floor between his feet. He had not slept much, but he had slept some, which was better than the night before, and he had eaten breakfast, which was better than most mornings in December. Neither of them talked on the drive in. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people who had already said what needed saying, and were now in the part that came after the saying, the part where you simply move toward the thing and see what it does when you get there. Silver Crossing was quiet at that hour. The bakery had smoke coming from its chimney, and the livery stable had light in its small window, but the main street was empty, and the bank's front steps were bare. Lenora pulled the carriage around the side of the building, out of the direct sight line of the road, and they sat for a moment. Aldous comes in early, she said. He's usually at his desk by 6. He doesn't like to be seen arriving, so he comes before most of the town is moving. How do you know that? I've had early banking business before, she said, and I pay attention. Calder got out of the carriage. He straightened his coat, checked that the letters were accessible without having to dig, and looked at the bank's side door. If this goes wrong, he said, it won't. But if it does? If it does, we still have the Territorial Banking Commission record and the Burgess confirmation, and those exist independent of anything Aldous says or doesn't say. She looked at him steadily. You're not walking in there to threaten him. You're walking in there to show him a door out of something he's been trapped in. Take doors. Calder nodded once. He went to the side door and knocked. 30 seconds of silence. Then the sound of a bolt being drawn, and the door opened, and Aldous stood there in his shirt sleeves, collar not yet fastened, looking like a man who had not expected company and was deciding rapidly how alarmed to be. He was smaller than Calder remembered, narrow shoulders, eyes that moved too fast. Mr. Boone, he said, Mr. Aldous. Calder kept his voice even, the way he kept his voice, even with a spooked horse, not falsely gentle, just steady, giving nothing to bolt from. I'd like a few minutes of your time. Inside, if you don't mind. The bank doesn't open until— I'm not here about banking hours, Calder said. I'm here about a bank draft from March of $1,890, $1,140. Originated from Burgess Livestock Auctions in Cheyenne. The color went out of Aldous' face in a way that was unambiguous and immediate. He did not say anything for a moment. His right hand on the doorframe tightened. Inside, he said. His voice had changed. Come inside. The bank's interior was cold, the stove not yet lit for the day. Aldous led him past the teller windows to his office in the back, a cramped room with a desk covered in papers and 2 chairs that had seen better decades. He closed the door behind them. He did not sit. He stood behind his desk with both hands on its surface and looked at Calder. Calder put the letters on the desk without a word. Aldous looked at them. He did not pick them up immediately. He looked at them the way a man looks at something he has been expecting and hoping would never actually arrive. Then he picked up the Burgess letter and read it, then the Banking Commission letter. He set them both down very carefully and looked at the wall to Calder's left for a long time. I have the county registry documents as well, Calder said quietly. The origination date discrepancy, the collateral listing for cattle that were sold and paid out before the foreclosure was filed, the 3 payment entries where the account numbers don't align with the official loan record. He paused. I have 11 years of my own ledger records from Red Mesa. My daughter found them in a box I kept without knowing why I was keeping it. Aldous pressed his fingers against his eyes briefly. It was a gesture so entirely human, so unguarded and exhausted that Calder felt something shift in him. Sympathy, exactly. But recognition. She's 11 years old, Calder said. Found what your entire bank staff apparently couldn't find or wouldn't look for. Aldous lowered his hands. He looked at Calder directly for the first time since opening the door, and his eyes were not the eyes of a dishonest man. They were the eyes of a man who had made a wrong decision and had been living inside it ever since, which was a different thing and almost worse, because a dishonest man sleeps fine. I didn't know what he intended, Aldous said, at the beginning. He presented the loan restructuring as a legitimate transaction. He said you had agreed to it. I never agreed to any restructuring. I know that now. When did you know it then? Aldous was quiet. When did you understand what he had done? Calder asked. His voice was still level. It cost him. When the foreclosure papers were filed, Aldous said. When I saw the final debt figures, he looked at the desk. The numbers were not what I had processed. I checked my own records, and the figures I had recorded were different from the figures on the foreclosure documents. I went to Pike. He told me I had made a clerical error. He showed me corrected versions of the internal records. Corrected versions that you had not created. No. But you accepted them. Aldous said nothing. You accepted false records that replaced your own work. Calder said, and then you showed those records to a man who came to you and said the debt was wrong, and you let him lose his ranch. The words sat in the cold air of the small office. Aldous had gone very still. He was not going to argue with any of it, Calder saw. The argument had already happened inside this man, many times, in the small hours of many nights, and it had always ended the same way, because the truth of it was not complicated. "I have a wife," Aldous said, "and 2 daughters. Pike told me that if I caused difficulty, he would ensure I lost this position. He has relationships with the bank's board of directors that I do not have." He stopped. "I know that is not a sufficient answer." "No," Calder said. "It's not." Aldous looked at the letters on his desk. "What do you want from me?" Calder leaned forward and put both hands flat on the desk, not threateningly, but to close the distance between them, to make the conversation as direct as it needed to be. "I want a written statement," he said, "describing what you processed, what Pike presented as corrections, and the dates on which each transaction occurred. Your own words, your own signature. I want the original internal records, the ones you created before Pike replaced them if they still exist." Aldous' jaw moved. He may have destroyed them. "Do you know that for certain?" "No." "Then look." Calder held his eyes. "And understand this, the Territorial Banking Commission already has a record of that draft. Burgess has a record of that sale. These documents exist outside this building, and outside this county, and outside Pike's reach. You can be the man who stayed silent while all of that comes to light. Or you can be the man who told the truth when someone finally came and asked the right question." Aldous looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "Give me until noon." Calder picked up the letters from the desk and returned them to his coat. "Noon," he said. He went back through the bank and out the side door into the cold morning air. Lenora was leaning against the side of the carriage with her arms crossed against the chill, watching the road. She looked at him when the door opened. "Well," she said. "Noon," Calder said. "He's looking for the original records." Lenora read his face. "He's going to cooperate, I think so. He's a man who's been wanting to cooperate for 2 years and hasn't had a good enough reason." Calder looked down the empty street. "He does now." They drove back to Hawthorne Ridge to wait out the morning, and the waiting was harder than the conversation had been. Calder worked on the remaining fence sections, because standing still was not something he had ever been good at, and Torres worked beside him without comment, and the morning moved like cold water, slow and thick and resistant. At 11, Calder cleaned up and changed his shirt and drove back into Silver Crossing alone, borrowing Lenora's second horse, a reliable bay gelding named something Torres called him that Calder could not pronounce and had taken to calling simply the bay. He tied the horse behind the bank and went to the side door. Aldous opened it immediately, which meant he had been watching for him. He was carrying a leather folder. He handed it to Calder without speaking. Inside were 4 handwritten pages in Aldous' neat bank clerk script, signed and dated that morning, describing in precise detail the sequence of events from the original loan processing through the foreclosure filing. And behind the written statement, a single folded document yellowed at the edges, slightly crumpled as if it had been folded many times and stored in a tight space. It was the original internal payment record for the Burgess bank draft. Aldous' own handwriting. $1,140 received March 24, 1000. $890 applied to Red Mesa Ranch cattle loan. Account number matching what Calder had in his own box. The account number that did not match the foreclosure documents. Because someone had changed the foreclosure documents. And this piece of paper proved it. "I kept it," Aldous said. He was looking at the floor beside Calder's boot. "I don't know exactly why. When Pike had the corrected records brought in, I put my original in the back of a personnel file, under a name that no longer works here. Told myself it was a safeguard." He paused. "I think I was just afraid to destroy it." Calder looked at the document in his hands. "Thank you," he said. Aldous looked up. I know it doesn't fix what happened," Calder said. "But it helps fix what happens next. That's enough for now." He rode back to Hawthorne Ridge with the folder inside his coat, pressed against his chest, and the bay gelding moved under him with the steady, uncomplicated reliability of a horse that had been well cared for and knew it. He was almost at the Ridge Road turnoff when he saw Pike's rider again, the blond young man, sitting a horse at the edge of the tree line off the main road, watching. Not even pretending to have a reason to be there. Calder looked at him directly and kept riding. That evening, he spread everything on Lenora's kitchen table. The original receipts from the pine box, Mara's copies, the county registry documents, the Burgess letter, the banking commission letter, Aldis's written statement, and the original internal payment record with Aldis's handwriting and the correct account number. Lenora looked at the assembled documents for a long time. "It's enough," she said. "To approach the court? To approach the territorial court, yes. But you need an attorney, Calder, not to build the case is already built. To present it in a way that the court is required to act on, and to prevent Pike from using legal procedural delays to run out the clock while he moves assets." Calder looked at the documents. "I don't have money for an attorney." "I do," Lenora said. He looked up. "Don't," she said before he could speak. "I'm not offering you charity, and I'm not offering you pity, and I'm not asking for anything in return. I'm telling you that I have the money to hire a competent territorial attorney, and that this situation merits one, and that the people who benefit from that attorney being hired are your children." She met his eyes. "Tell me that's not worth setting aside your pride for one day." The muscle in his jaw worked. "I'll pay it back," he said. "I know you will," she said in the tone of someone who has decided not to argue about it. "I know a man in Cheyenne. His name is Hartwell. He practices at the territorial level. He has a clean reputation, and he has argued fraud cases before the land court before." "How do you know him?" "He handled the estate proceedings when my husband died. He's thorough and he's honest, and he does not take cases he doesn't believe in." She picked up Aldis's statement. "He'll believe in this." Calder looked at his children's faces in his mind, Mara doing sums at the kitchen table, Eli following Torres around the paddock with his hands in his belt loops, imitating a grown man. He looked at the documents on the table. He looked at the woman who had given them a cottage and wages and books and riding lessons, and now this. "Write the letter tonight," he said. They wrote it together, again with Mara awake late to copy the final version in her clear hand. The girl did not complain about the hour. She sat at the table in her nightgown with her hair in a braid and copied each word precisely. And when she was done, she read it back and caught one error in the property description that Calder had copied wrong from the county records and corrected it without being asked. Lenora was watching Mara when this happened. She said nothing, but she watched. Hartwell arrived from Cheyenne 8 days later, a compact man in his 50s with gray at his temples, and the unhurried manner of someone who had seen enough of human foolishness that very little of it surprised him anymore. He came to Hawthorne Ridge rather than meeting in town, which Lenora had arranged specifically, and he sat at the same kitchen table and went through every document with the same focused silence that Lenora brought to things that mattered. It took him 2 hours. When he finished, he looked at Calder and said, "Where did you find the internal payment record?" Bank manager kept it. Why? He said he didn't know why. I think he was telling the truth. Hartwell considered this. Will he testify to its authenticity? He signed a statement. Yes. Hartwell put all the documents together in a precise stack and folded his hands on top of them. Mr. Boone, what you have here constitutes clear evidence of loan document falsification, fraudulent foreclosure, and misappropriation of payment. Territorial court will hear this. He paused. However, you should understand that Pike will fight it. He has resources and relationships, and he will hire attorneys of his own who will use every procedural mechanism available to delay and complicate. How long does something like this take? Lenora asked. Properly pressed, with this level of documentation, 6 to 8 weeks for a preliminary injunction freezing Pike's use of the Red Mesa assets. Full resolution could be 3 to 4 months. Calder absorbed this. The injunction first, he said. If Pike hears we're moving legally, he'll try to liquidate. He needs to be stopped from selling off Red Mesa's cattle and assets before any judgment. Hartwell looked at him with a slight reassessment. Exactly right. I'll file for the injunction first thing. How fast? I can have the filing ready to submit by end of this week. Court should schedule a hearing within 10 days. It was moving. It was actually moving. Calder stood up and shook Hartwell's hand and did not say much else, because the things he might have said were too large for the room. Then everything nearly fell apart. 4 days after Hartwell rode back to Cheyenne to prepare the filing, One of Lenora's ranch hands, a young man named Dex, who had been with Hawthorne Ridge for less than a season, and who Calder had never entirely trusted because of the way he avoided direct answers, rode into Silver Crossing on his half-day. Off and had 3 drinks at the saloon and talked. He did not talk specifically. He talked around. He mentioned that things were interesting up at Hawthorne Ridge these days, that the Boone fellow seemed to be doing more than fence work, that there were visitors coming and going. That Mrs. Ashcombe had been sending a lot of correspondence lately. It was enough. Pike was smart. He had been smart, all along patient and precise, and always 3 steps ahead of the people he was stealing from. He heard what Dex said, or a version of it filtered through the Silver Crossing rumor apparatus, and he understood what it meant. Calder found out about it 2 days before the court filing was due to be submitted, when Torres came to find him at the fence line with his face carrying the specific expression of someone delivering bad news that cannot be delayed. Dex talked in town, Torres said. Calder set down the tamping bar. What did he say? Enough. Pike knows something is moving. Torres looked at the ridge line. This morning early, before I was out of the bunkhouse, I heard Pike's rider on the east road, going toward Red Mesa, heading to Red Mesa, moving fast. Calder thought for approximately 4 seconds. How many cattle are still on Red Mesa's land, he asked. Torres looked at him. I don't know the exact number. Pike has been running it as his own operation for a year. He moved some to his other property south of here. Maybe 150, maybe 200 head still on Red Mesa Range. If he moves them across the territorial line before the injunction is filed. Cattle are gone, Torres said, and the physical evidence of his operation is gone. It was the spring herd all over again. It was the thing Pike did when he was cornered. He moved the assets. He had done it to Calder's money through paperwork, and now he was going to do it to Calder's cattle through a pass in the mountains before any court could stop him. Calder was already moving toward the paddock. He went to the main house at a pace short of running and knocked twice and opened the door before Lenora could answer it, which he had never done before. She was at her desk. She looked up at his face and stood immediately. He told her in 20 seconds. She said, Hartwell's filing isn't submitted yet. No, it goes in day after tomorrow. Pike knows that window. Yes. Calder looked at the wall for a moment, calculating. Red Mesa's northern range was 20 miles from Hawthorne Ridge. The mountain pass that led to the territorial line was another 12 miles beyond that. A herd being pushed hard in cold weather could cover 15 miles a day. If Pike's men had started this morning, I have to go after them, he said. Lenora looked at him. If he gets the cattle across the territorial line before the injunction is in place, we lose the physical proof that he's been running Red Mesa as a producing operation, Calder said. The documents prove the fraud on paper. The cattle prove he profited from it. Without them, the damages claim is harder to make. And he knows it. You're going alone? I'm going fast. Torres is one man, and you're one man. She looked at him with that steady assessment she brought to things she was deciding quickly. Give me 10 minutes. Lenora, 10 minutes, she said, already moving past him toward the back of the house. He went to the barn. He saddled the bay gelding and had Torres's horse ready when Torres appeared, and then he saddled a third horse, Lenora's gray mare, a strong animal built for distance, and he was leading all 3 out of the barn when Lenora came out of the house in her riding coat with a saddlebag over one shoulder. She handed him the saddlebag without comment. He looked inside it. Food rope, a folded tarpaulin, a box of matches. You planned for the weather, he said. Someone has to. She took her mare's reins. I need to send Mara to town, he said. She needs to wire Hartwell. He has to know what's happening, and he needs to push that filing through today, not day after tomorrow. I'll send one of the other hands with her. Mara can wire the telegraph herself, Calder said. She just needs someone to ride beside her. Lenora did not argue with that assessment of Mara's competence. She went back and spoke to one of the other ranch hands, while Calder found Mara in the cottage and told her what needed doing. Mara listened. She asked 2 questions: the name of the attorney, the specific message to convey, and she was pulling on her coat before he finished answering the second one. Be careful, he told her. I know what careful means, she said. You be careful too. She rode out with the ranch hand, heading south to Silver Crossing, and Calder, Lenora, and Torres rode north toward Red Mesa at the best pace the ground would allow. The weather turned on them within the hour. Wyoming spring was unreliable on its best day, and this was not its best day. Cloud came off the mountains in a gray mass, and the temperature dropped 15 degrees in 30 minutes, and the wind shifted to the northwest, which was the direction of real trouble. Not a blizzard, not quite, but the kind of driving cold rain that was worse than snow in some ways because it soaked through everything and sapped heat methodically. They pushed through it. Calder rode slightly ahead of the others, reading the ground. Cattle leave a trail that a man who has worked cattle all his life can read like text, the press of hooves in soft earth, the way mud turns at the edges when a herd has passed, the particular displacement of grass. He found it an hour north of Hawthorne Ridge, cutting across open range toward the mountain road. A large herd, moving fast, which meant they were being pushed hard. At least 150, he called back to Torres over the wind. Torres looked at the trail. Maybe more, they rode. The mountain road climbed in switchbacks through terrain that was steep enough to slow horses and worse for a herd. That was the only thing working in their favor. You could not move cattle quickly on a mountain road in bad weather. Pike's men would be fighting the animals the whole way. The rain came harder. Lenora rode without complaint, which he had expected, and she rode well, which he had also expected, but which he noticed anyway. She was not a woman who put herself into situations she could not handle. She stayed close to Torres on the narrower sections and did not talk much, and kept her gray mare moving at a pace that matched the ground. They found the rear of the herd 2 miles into the mountain road, emerging through rain and mist as a dark mass of moving shapes and noise. Calder pulled the bay to a stop. There were 4 riders working the herd's flanks. He could see 2 more at the point ahead. 6 men total. Against 3 of them. We can't stop them physically, Torres said. No, Calder said. We don't try. He had already thought this through, riding. Stopping a herd with 3 people against 6 drivers was not possible without guns, and he had not come here to start a shooting incident that would bury the legal case under a different kind of trouble. What he needed was time, and witnesses. He turned to Lenora. Did you contact the territorial livestock inspector before we left? I sent a wire from the house before I came out, she said. He looked at her. I told you 10 minutes, she said. That was 8 of them. He almost said something, but there wasn't time. Where would he come from? His office is in Farwell Junction, 12 miles east of the pass. She met his eyes. If he received the wire and acted on it, he could intercept the herd at the pass. If, she agreed. It was not a plan, it was a hope with some structure around it. But it was what they had. Then we need to slow this herd down, Calder said. He looked at the mountain road ahead. It climbed another 3 miles before it reached a flat section near the tree line, and then another steep mile to the pass itself. The cattle were moving, but they were nervous, the weather, the unfamiliar terrain, the pace they were being pushed at. Nervous cattle could be worked. Torres, he said. The east side of that road, 300 yards ahead, there's a creek runoff that crosses the road in wet weather. Is it running today? Torres looked at the sky and the terrain and calculated in the way of someone who knew this land. Yes, probably knee-deep on the cattle. If the point riders hit that crossing in this rain with the herd behind them moving this fast. The front of the herd stops, Torres said. The back piles into the front. Takes 20 minutes to sort. Ride east through the timber, Calder said. Come out ahead of the point riders. Let them see you. If they think someone's blocking the road ahead, the point riders will slow to assess. That slows the whole herd. And you, Torres asked. Calder was already turning the bay. I'm going to talk to Pike. He rode along the edge of the herd on the uphill side of the road, pushing the bay through brush and rough ground, working forward until he could see the middle section of the drive, and then the point. And there was Orson Pike himself on a big black horse, riding just behind the lead cattle, with his hat pulled low against the rain. Pike saw him at the same moment. Calder rode directly toward him and stopped 15 feet away. Pike looked at him. Then he looked at Lenora, who had followed Calder to the point. Then he looked at the rain falling on both of them, as if the weather was personally insulting him. Boone, he said. His voice was the voice of a man who is prepared for this moment and has decided how to play it. You're in the way of a legitimate cattle operation. These are Red Mesa cattle, Calder said. They've been Red Mesa cattle since I bred them. The double-notch brand on their left hip was registered to my operation in the Territorial Livestock Registry in 1887. The brand transfers with the ownership, Pike said. I purchased this operation through legal foreclosure. Except the foreclosure was not legal. Pike looked at him for a long moment. The rain made small sounds on his hat brim and on the backs of the cattle moving past them both. You're a desperate man making desperate accusations, Pike said. You have nothing. I have a bank draft record from the Territorial Banking Commission, Calder said. I have the original internal payment record from Silver Crossing Bank in Aldis's own handwriting, showing $1,140 applied to my cattle loan, the same loan you claimed was fully outstanding when you filed the foreclosure. He watched Pike's face. I have Aldis's signed statement. Something moved in Pike's eyes. Not fear exactly, recalculation. Aldis, Pike said, and his voice had changed, dropped into something quieter and colder. He kept the original, Calder said, for 2 years. I think some part of him was waiting for someone to come ask the right question. I'll have that statement challenged. Aldis is a compromised employee with a history of clerical errors. Any court will also receive a filing from attorney Wallace Hartwell in Cheyenne, Lenora said from beside Calder. Her voice was calm and carrying over the wind. Who is submitting an injunction today against any transfer or disposal of Red Mesa assets pending fraud review? Pike looked at her. Lenora, he said, in a different tone, the one men use when they think a woman can be separated from the situation by being addressed personally. You understand that whatever Boone has told you, he's minus. I've read every document, she said. I was there when Aldis gave us the original payment record. I am one of the witnesses to its authenticity. She looked at him with the particular calm of someone who has nothing to be afraid of. You should think carefully about what you do next. That moment, from ahead on the road, came the sound of the cattle hitting the creek, crossing the specific noise of a herd, stopping hard, animals bunching, the shouts of riders, trying to manage the compression from the back. And from the pass above, emerging through the rain, came 2 riders moving downhill at a purposeful pace. Calder saw them before Pike did. One of them was wearing a territorial badge. The other, to Calder's profound surprise, was Foss, the county records clerk, who had apparently decided that 30 years of maintaining documents meant he had some interest in seeing them properly used. Pike turned and saw the riders. He sat very still on his big black horse in the rain. Calder watched him work through it. The herd stalled at the creek crossing, the injunction filing going in today, Aldis's statement already signed. The territorial livestock inspector now coming down the pass road with documentary authority to halt any cross-border transfer, pending legal review. Pike had spent 2 years building something from a foundation of forged paper and a grieving man's distraction. And Calder had spent 2 months in a borrowed cottage with a pine box full of receipts and a daughter who was better with numbers than anyone had bothered to notice. Pike looked at Calder. For a moment, just a moment, the composure cracked. Not dramatically, not into rage or grief or any of the things men show in stories when the game turns. Just a small fracture, a tightening around the eyes, a shifting of weight in the saddle, the look of a man who has played a long, careful hand and has just understood that the last card has been turned. Then he pulled his horse around and rode back through the herd without a word. His riders looked at each other. One of them, an older man with a weathered face, looked at Calder. What do we do with the herd? Hold them where they are, Calder said. The inspector will need to verify the brands. The man nodded as if this were ordinary instruction from a man with authority, which in that moment, on that road, in the rain it was. The territorial livestock inspector pulled up beside Calder and introduced himself as Marsh. He looked at the herd and at the badges and at Calder's coat, which was soaked through, and he said, I got a wire about a fraudulent transfer of branded livestock. Yes, Calder said. I can show you the documentation. Marsh looked at Lenora. She's my witness, Calder said. Marsh looked back at Calder. You're the registered owner of the double-notch brand? I am. Then let's get out of this rain, Marsh said, and you can show me what you've got. Calder looked at Lenora. She had rain on her face and mud on her coat, and her gray mare was blowing hard from the climb. and she looked nothing like the carefully dressed woman who had stepped out of a carriage in Silver Crossing 2 months ago and refused to laugh at a man fixing a wheel in the street. She looked better than that, actually. She looked like someone who had ridden 12 miles through bad weather because she had decided something was worth doing and had not stopped until it was done. He did not say any of that. He said, "Thank you for the wire to the inspector." She said 8 minutes, and turned her mare toward the trees where there was some shelter from the rain, and Calder rode after her, and Torres came behind with a small sound that might have been a laugh suppressed before it fully formed. The cattle stood on the mountain road in the rain, going nowhere, their double-notch brands clear on their left hips for anyone to read, waiting to be counted and verified and returned to the man they had always belonged to. They came down from the mountain in the late afternoon, soaked through and mud-covered and silent, with the particular quiet of people who have just done something that cannot be undone and are only beginning to understand what comes next. Marshal Marsh rode with them as far as the Silver Crossing turnoff, carrying Calder's documents in his saddlebag wrapped in oilcloth against the rain, and the double-notch herd came behind them under the management of 2 of Marsh's deputies who had appeared from Farwell Junction, with a practicality that suggested Marsh had been in this business long enough to bring reinforcement when a wire used the word fraudulent. Foss rode beside Torres and said nothing, which was consistent with everything Calder knew about the man. He had appeared at the pass when needed, and that appeared to be the full extent of what he intended to explain about himself. Calder asked him once, when the road widened enough to ride abreast. "Why did you come?" Foss looked at the road ahead. "I've kept records for 30 years, he said. "When someone misuses what's in my records, I take it somewhat personally." That was the complete answer. Foss did not offer more, and Calder did not ask for it. They stopped at the edge of town as the last light was going gray behind the mountains. Marsh pulled up and looked at Calder. "The injunction Hartwell is filing," he said. "Has it gone in?" "It should have gone in today. Mara was sending the wire this morning." Marsh chewed on something not tobacco, just thought. "I'll verify with the court in the morning. In the meantime, the herd is under my office's administrative hold pending brand verification and legal review. Pike's men know that now." He looked at Calder directly. "You understand he'll come at this hard." "I know. He has 2 attorneys in Cheyenne he uses regularly. One of them is genuinely skilled. You need Hartwell ready for a fight, not just a filing. I'll wire him tonight." Marsh nodded. He started to turn his horse, then stopped. "The Aldis statement. Is it witnessed?" "Aldis signed it in the presence of Mrs. Ashcombe." Marsh looked at Lenora, then back at Calder. "Good witness," he said, and rode south toward the Silver Crossing stable. Lenora said, very quietly, beside Calder, "I'll choose not to decide how to take that." "Take it as a compliment," Calder said. "He doesn't hand those out." They rode the rest of the way to Hawthorne Ridge in the dark. Mara was awake when they arrived, sitting at the cottage table with the lamp on, and a cup of cold tea she had forgotten to drink beside her. She stood up when Calder came through the door and looked at his face the way she always looked at his face, now reading it, before he said a word. "Worked," she said. "The herd is stopped. The inspector has the documents. Hartwell should have filed by now." Mara let out a breath that she had apparently been holding for most of the day. "I sent the wire," she said, "and I waited for a reply." Hartwell wired back at 2 o'clock the filing was submitted to the territorial court at 1:45. Calder stood in the doorway of his borrowed cottage, wet and cold and bone-tired, and looked at his 11-year-old daughter who had ridden into town alone with a ranch hand she barely knew and transmitted a legal wire to an attorney in Cheyenne with the accuracy of someone who did this sort of thing regularly. "Good," he said. "You did good." She looked at him steadily for a moment. "Are you hurt?" "No. You look hurt. I'm just cold." She went to the stove and started building it up without being asked, which was Mara's way of taking care of something she could not say directly, and Calder sat down and let her do it, because some things you accept. Eli slept through all of it in the back bedroom with the cat pressed against his legs, which was, Calder thought, exactly right. The next 6 weeks were unlike anything Calder had experienced before, and he had experienced a foreclosure, a death, and a Wyoming winter without adequate shelter, so his baseline for difficult was not low. Hartwell came down from Cheyenne 4 days after the mountain road and set up his working base at the Silver Crossing Hotel, which put him directly in the middle of the town's social nervous system. A choice that Calder thought was either very smart or very oblivious, until he realized it was very smart. Hartwell wanted Pike's people to see him there every morning having breakfast and taking meetings. He wanted the pressure of visibility. Pike's attorney, a man named Carver, who arrived 2 days after Hartwell with a leather case and an expression of professional disdain, went immediately to the county records office and spent 6 hours with Foss, going through everything that Foss would allow him to access, which was everything that was public record, which Foss provided with complete cooperation because Foss believed in the records and trusted them to say what they said without editorial assistance from him. What Carver found in the county records did not help Pike. What helped Pike was money, which he had considerable amounts of, and relationships, which he had cultivated carefully in this territory for 15 years, and the simple procedural weight of being the party in current legal possession of the property in question. Courts moved cautiously around established possession. Hartwell had explained this to Calder from the start, in the matter-of-fact way of a man who believes clients are served better by accurate information than by false comfort. The preliminary injunction is in place, Hartwell told him on a Tuesday morning at Hawthorne Ridge, with Lenora present and Ma present sitting in the corner pretending to read while actually listening to every word. That prevents Pike from transferring, selling, or otherwise disposing of Red Mesa assets during the review. The fraud case itself will require a formal hearing before a territorial judge, and Carver has filed 2 procedural motions already, one challenging Aldis's standing as a witness given his employment relationship with the bank, and one questioning the admissibility of your original receipts on the grounds of chain of custody. The chain of custody on my own receipts, Calder said flatly. Carver is very good at his job, Hartwell said, without admiration, the way you acknowledge an unpleasant fact. He's arguing that documents kept in a private wooden box for 2 years, without formal witnessing or official storage, cannot be reliably authenticated. They're in my handwriting. Yes. Which is why I've engaged a document examiner from Denver to authenticate them. That costs money and time, both of which Pike has more of than you do and is counting on that asymmetry. Lenora said, from across the table, "What do we need that we don't currently have?" Hartwell looked at her. Corroboration. Specifically, I'd like to find at least one other rancher who dealt with Pike around the same period and has documentation of similar irregularities. Pike did not do this once. Men like Pike find a method that works, and they use it until it stops working. He paused. If we can show the court a pattern rather than a single incident, Carver's procedural challenges become substantially harder to sustain. Calder thought about that. He thought about the conversations he'd had in the weeks since arriving at Silver Crossing, the small things that hadn't quite fit, that he had filed away without knowing why. Delgado, the Mexican rancher who had hired him for fence work without asking questions. The way Delgado had mentioned once, offhandedly, a bank loan he'd had trouble with 2 years back. Calder had not pressed it then because it was not his business. It was his business now. He rode south the next morning to Delgado's spread, a modest but well-run operation that showed the marks of a man who worked hard and wasted nothing. Delgado came out to meet him in the yard with an expression that was not unfriendly but was carefully neutral. Calder did not approach it sideways. He told Delgado directly what he had found, what Hartwell was doing, and what he was looking for. Delgado listened without interrupting. When Calder finished, Delgado was quiet for a long moment, looking at the middle distance in the way of someone who has been quiet about something for a while and is deciding whether to keep being quiet. The loan was in 1,890, Delgado said finally. I borrowed against my spring cattle to cover the cost of the south well. The interest charges I received at the end of the year were higher than the contract specified. He looked at Calder. I paid them because I could cover it, and I did not want trouble with the bank. I still have the original contract. And the year-end statement that showed the higher charges? Yes. Does the account number on the year-end statement match the account number on the original contract? Delgado looked at him very steadily. I never checked that. Check it tonight, Calder said. He rode back to Hawthorne Ridge and told Hartwell, and Hartwell rode to Delgado's spread the next morning and spent 2 hours there, and came back, looking like a man who has found the second piece of a thing he had been hoping was not unique. Different victim, same mechanism, Hartwell said at the kitchen table that evening. Different account number, inflated interest calculation, small enough that a man who could cover it would rather pay and avoid the confrontation. Delgado kept both documents. He put his hands flat on the table. That's the pattern. Are there others? Lenora asked. Almost certainly. I've identified 2 more ranchers in this valley who had bank dealings with Pike in that period and subsequently had financial difficulties they attributed to other causes. I want to talk to both of them this week. Both of them, it turned out, had documents. One had kept records out of habit. One had kept records out of suspicion. She had never been able to act on a woman named Breckett, who ran a small horse breeding operation northwest of Silver Crossing, and who, when Hartwell sat down across her kitchen table and explained what he was looking for, went to a tin box on her kitchen shelf and produced 5 years of banking correspondence with the Silver Crossing Bank that she had maintained with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had never quite trusted the numbers she was given. Her account number discrepancies were the clearest of any of them. Hartwell came back from Breckett's with color in his face, which was the most visible excitement Calder had ever seen from him. 4 cases, Hartwell said. 4 separate ranchers, 3 separate loan types, same bank, same period, same mechanism. Carver cannot argue unique clerical error against 4 documented instances with consistent methodology. He looked at Calder. We're no longer presenting a fraud case. We're presenting a systematic scheme. Calder sat with that for a moment. A systematic scheme. Not one desperate man who saw an opportunity in a grieving widower's distraction. A deliberate, patient, repeated practice of stealing from people who were too stretched or too trusting or too alone to fight back. He thought about that for the rest of the evening and into the night, lying on the cottage bed listening to the spring wind and feeling the anger settle into something harder and more permanent than it had been before. Not hotter, cooler, the kind of anger that does not want to break things. The kind that wants to build a case so airtight that the man who built this scheme on other people's grief has nowhere left to stand. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday, the 4th week of May, in the territorial court in Farwell Junction, before a judge named Calloway, who Hartwell described as meticulous and stubborn, and not particularly susceptible to charm or pressure, which Hartwell appeared to consider ideal. In the days before the hearing, Silver Crossing became a different kind of uncomfortable. Word had moved through the town, not the whole story, not the documented truth, but enough. People knew a legal case was being made against Pike. People knew it involved the bank. People who had previously been loud about Calder's failure were now conspicuously quiet about it, which was its own kind of statement. Connell, the red-bearded cattle broker who had laughed at Calder from across the street on that first bitter afternoon, crossed to the other side of the road when he saw Calder coming. Not from hostility, from embarrassment, which Calder found almost worse, because embarrassment meant Connell understood what he had done and was hoping not to be asked to account for it. 2 shopkeepers who had refused Calder credit in February now nodded to him on the street. One of them offered a half-apologetic word about the weather. Calder nodded back and kept walking, because he had nothing to say to them that was worth saying. The day before the hearing, Pike made his last move. Calder was coming out of the telegraph office after confirming the travel arrangements with Hartwell when he found Pike waiting for him on the walk outside. Alone, which was unusual. Pike's blonde errand rider was visible at the far end of the street, but staying back. Pike looked tired. Calder noticed it because Pike had not looked tired before. He was the kind of man who wore authority. So naturally it functioned as a kind of rest. And the absence of it now showed in the set of his jaw and the way he was standing, which was slightly less settled than usual. "Boone," he said. Calder stopped. He did not say anything. "I want to make you an offer," Pike said. "You made one before. Outside the bank 3 months ago, you offered me money to disappear." Calder looked at him. "I didn't take it then. This is a different offer." Pike's voice was steady, the voice of a man who has prepared this and is delivering it with precision. "Court case is going to cost you time and money you don't have. Even if you win the legal argument, The ranch has been operated for a year under my management. Equipment, improvements, labor costs, those will all be disputed. The actual recovery could take another 6 months in court. I'm aware of that. I'm prepared to sign an immediate restoration of the Red Mesa title. No court, no delays. You get the ranch back this week. Calder studied him. In exchange for what, he said. Withdrawal of the fraud case. Hartwell drops the filing. The other rancher's case is Delgado. The Breckett woman, those go away too. You'd need them to agree to that. I'm asking you first. Calder looked at Pike for a long moment. He looked at the face of the man who had sat beside him at a bank counter and watched him hand over cash payments that were never properly recorded, who had waited until his wife was in the ground to execute the final steps of a plan he had been constructing for years, who had taken a ranch that Calder had spent 15 years building with his hands and his children's future, and had used it to run cattle under his own name, while the man who built it slept in a wagon with his kids. No, Calder said. Pike's jaw tightened. You're making this harder than it needs to. You stole from 4 people, Calder said. You stole from a Mexican rancher who said nothing because he didn't want trouble. You stole from a woman who kept every piece of paper she'd ever received from you because some part of her knew something was wrong, and she didn't know how to prove it. You stole from a man named Delgado, who worked that land with his own hands and paid your inflated charges because he could just barely cover them and didn't know he was allowed to fight. Calder took one step closer. And you timed what you did to me for the 3 months after I buried my wife. You watched me carry my children's grief and my own, and you decided that was the right moment. Pike said nothing. Red Mesa isn't the price of your freedom, Calder said. It's mine. And I'm going to get it back through a court of law in front of a judge, and every piece of documentation we have. And that record will exist permanently in this territory, so that the next rancher you decide to target will have somewhere to look. He walked past Pike without waiting for a response. His hands were shaking slightly inside his coat pockets. He kept them there until he was around the corner. He stood in the alley beside the hardware store for a moment and breathed. Then he walked back to the livery, got the bay gelding, and rode back to Hawthorne Ridge to tell Lenora and Hartwell what had just happened. Hartwell's response, when Calder finished, was to pick up his pen and write 3 additional notes into his case file. Good, he said, without looking up. Offer of settlement 2 days before a hearing indicates he's assessed his position and found it weaker than he's been presenting. Lenora said nothing for a moment after Calder finished. She looked at the table. Then she said, "Are you all right?" It was the directness of it that caught him, not a polite inquiry, not a social formula, but an actual question from someone actually asking. "I'm better than I was an hour ago," he said. It was the most honest answer he had. She nodded. She stood up and went to the stove, and came back with 2 cups of coffee that she had apparently been making while he talked. And she set one in front of him and kept the other for herself and sat back down. Hartwell took his notes to his room. They sat at the table with the coffee and the evening light, and neither of them said anything for a while. He waited until after Martha died, Calder said, not to explain it to Lenora, who already knew it, but because he was still working through the shape of it. Yes. I keep thinking if she'd been alive, if she'd been at the ranch when the foreclosure papers came. Martha kept better records than I did. She was sharper about the numbers. He stopped. Lenora waited. She would have found it, he said. What Mara found. She would have looked at those documents, and she would have known immediately. Yes, Lenora said quietly. That's probably why he waited. The words landed in the room and sat there. Calder looked at his hands around the coffee cup. I've been angry at him for what he did to me and my children, he said. I've been angry since March of last year, but I didn't understand until just now that he also knew he calculated that without her, I'd be too broken to see it clearly. He breathed in through his nose and out again. That's a different thing, using a man's grief as part of the mechanism. Lenora looked at him across the table. It is, she said. It's an uglier thing, she paused, and it also means he miscalculated. Because he didn't account for Mara. Calder looked up. He planned against a broken man, Lenora said. He didn't plan against your daughter going through a box and knowing what she was looking at. A small something moved across her face. That was not quite a smile, but was in that direction. Martha raised that girl. I'd say that accounts for something. Calder sat with that. It accounted for a great deal, actually. He had not let himself think about Martha, and the case together had kept them in separate rooms in his mind, one full of grief and one full of anger, because mixing them seemed dangerous. But Lenora was right. Mara's precision, her instinct for numbers, her refusal to accept a figure that didn't add up, those did not come from Calder's side of things. He was good with cattle and land and physical work. Martha had been the one who kept the books with the particular joy of someone who found order satisfying for its own sake. She had taught Mara without knowing she was teaching anything, and Mara had used it when it mattered. "Thank you for saying that," he said. Lenora drank her coffee and looked out the window at the darkening pasture. "I like the sound of her," she said, "from what you've described." "She would have liked you," Calder said. He had not intended to say it. It came out before he could evaluate it. He expected it to land awkwardly, and it did not. Lenora simply received it, the way she received most things, without making more of it than it was or less than it was. "That's a considerable thing to say," she said. "It's the truth," he said. They left for Farwell Junction the next morning in 2 carriages, Calder and Hartwell in one, Lenora with Delgado and Mrs. Breckett, who had agreed to attend the hearing as supporting witnesses, in the other. Torres stayed at Hawthorne Ridge with Mara and Eli, which had been the source of a significant argument between Calder and Mara the evening before. "I found the documents," Mara said. "I wrote the letters. I sent the wire. I know. I should be there. You're 11. That hasn't stopped me from doing anything useful so far." Calder had looked at his daughter across the cottage table and felt the familiar sensation of arguing with someone who was entirely correct and still had to be overruled. "The hearing may take all day," he said. "It will be a long ride and a longer wait. If something goes wrong, if Carver does something we're not expecting, I need to be completely focused on Hartwell and the case. Can't do that if I'm also watching out for you." Mara was quiet for a moment. "That's actually a real reason," she said. "Thank you. I still think I should be there. I know. Stay with Torres. Keep Eli from naming any more of the cattle." "Too late. He named 2 more yesterday. The black one is Sergeant." Calder had rubbed his face and gone to bed. The Farwell Junction Courthouse was a solid sandstone building that looked like it had been designed by someone who believed courtrooms should feel permanent, which Calder appreciated more than he would have a year ago. Judge Calloway was a heavy-set man with a gray beard and reading spectacles, and the manner of someone who had been listening to people argue about property for long enough that he required actual evidence rather than performance. Carver had brought 2 associates. He had also, Calder noticed when they entered, brought 2 representatives from the Silver Crossing Bank's board of directors, who sat in the gallery with the careful neutrality of men who were not defendants, but were very interested in the outcome. Calder noted their faces. Hartwell began with the documentation, laying it out in chronological order, building the case the way a fence was built, starting with the foundation posts and working outward, making sure each element was anchored before moving to the next. He spoke with the measured precision of someone who had done this enough times that the performance was entirely internal, the visible surface just the clear stating of facts. Burgess letter. The Territorial Banking Commission record. The original Aldis payment record. Aldis's signed statement, which Aldis, who was present, looking like a man attending his own sentencing, confirmed under Calloway's direct questioning with a voice that shook slightly but did not fail. Then the county registry discrepancy. Then the loan origination date. Then Calder's own ledgers, authenticated by the Denver Document Examiner's report that Hartwell had submitted 3 days prior. Carver objected. He objected carefully and professionally to several elements, and Calloway sustained 2 of the objections regarding technical admissibility, which Hartwell had anticipated and had alternative documentation ready for both. This exchange between the 2 attorneys went on for some time, and Calder sat through it with his hands flat on the table and his face giving nothing away, because he had learned from a year of being watched and assessed, and judged how to hold himself still under conditions that made stillness very difficult. Then Hartwell called Delgado. Delgado testified with the same economy he brought to everything: no dramatics, no editorial, simply the facts of his transaction and the documented discrepancy, and the years he had spent paying charges he now understood he had never actually owed. He produced his documents. He was unshakable under Carver's cross-examination because he was telling the truth and the documents supported it. And there was nothing in Carver's considerable professional arsenal that could change either of those things. Then Mrs. Beckett. She had brought her tin box. Calloway looked at the tin box with the expression of a judge who has seen many things in evidence and was not expecting a tin box from a kitchen shelf. He allowed it. Beckett laid out 5 years of correspondence with the same methodical clarity she apparently brought to horse breeding records. The pattern in her documents was, as Hartwell had said, the clearest of any of them. The account number shift was visible to anyone looking, had always been visible to Beckett herself for years, without her having any mechanism to act on it. When she finished, the courtroom was very quiet. Calloway looked at Pike, who was sitting at the opposing table with Carver beside him, and 2 feet of air between them that felt like more. "Mr. Pike," Calloway said, in the tone of a judge addressing a man he has formed a view of, "your counsel has challenged the chain of custody for Mr. Boone's personal documents. I am prepared to rule on that motion. However, I note that the Territorial Banking Commission's records, the Burgess Auction House's records, and the county registry documents are not in dispute as to their custody. I'd like Mr. Carver to explain to me how the account number appearing in those 3 independent records differs from the account number appearing in the foreclosure documents filed in this court." Carver said something measured and procedural that was, in Calloway's evident view, not an explanation. Calloway looked at him over his spectacles. "That's not what I asked," Calloway said. The room was quiet again. What followed took most of the afternoon, which was the part Hartwell had warned Calder about the grinding procedural work of a judge examining each element, each objection, each counter-argument in the meticulous way of a man who intended to be very certain before he put his name to anything. Calloway was not fast. He was thorough, and thorough took time, and Calder sat through every minute of it with his hands flat on the table and his face still. At 4:15 in the afternoon, Calloway set his pen down. He looked at the room over his spectacles. He said that the evidence of systematic account number manipulation across multiple loan accounts constituted, in his view, clear and documentable fraud. He said that the loan origination date discrepancies, corroborated by the Banking Commission's records, invalidated the interest calculations underlying the foreclosure. He said that the Burgess payment, documented by 3 independent sources and recorded nowhere in the official debt record, confirmed that the foreclosure had been executed against a debt that did not exist in the amount claimed. He said that Red Mesa Ranch was being restored to its legal owner, Calder Boone, effective immediately, with all assets intact under the existing injunction. He said that the evidence indicated further investigation was warranted into the Silver Crossing Bank's internal oversight processes, and that he would be referring the matter to the Territorial Banking Commission for review. He looked at Pike. He said that the conduct documented in the record before him represented a serious breach of fiduciary duty and an abuse of legal process, and that if Pike's counsel had further arguments to make, he would hear them at a follow-up proceeding scheduled 30 days hence. Then he gathered his papers and left the bench. The room took a moment to understand it was over. Calder sat very still at the table. Hartwell put a hand briefly on his shoulder, said "well done," which was the most Hartwell had ever said that wasn't directly case-related, and began organizing his documents. Delgado, from behind the bar, caught Calder's eye and gave him a single nod, a small, complete gesture that held everything they both understood about what had just happened and didn't need to be said. Beckett was already talking to one of Hartwell's associates about her own recovery claim, which Hartwell had told her the ruling today substantially supported. Calder stood up. He turned around. Lenora was in the 3rd row of the gallery. She had been there through the entire afternoon, still and quiet in the way she was, still and quiet when something needed her full attention. She looked at his face when he turned, and he looked at hers. She stood up. She did not cross the bar and throw her arms around him, which he would not have known what to do with and which was not, in any case, her manner. Came through the gate and stopped in front of him and looked at him for a moment. "It's yours again," she said. "Yes." His voice came out rougher than he intended. She looked at him for another moment, steady and clear and entirely present. the way she had been looking at him since the day she stepped out of her carriage and refused to laugh at a man fixing a wheel in the street. "Your children are going to be very happy," she said. He thought about Mara, who had found the box. He thought about Eli, who had asked in a small voice in the worst weeks whether they would ever have a home again. "Yes," he said, "they are." Outside the courthouse, the evening was coming on cold and clear. No rain, the mountains purple-edged against a sky that had finally decided to be clean. Lenora's carriage was in the yard, and Calder's horse was tied at the rail, and the town of Farwell Junction was going about its ordinary business, in the ordinary way of a place where nothing remarkable had just happened. Remarkable things always looked like that from the outside. Calder stood at the top of the courthouse steps and looked north, in the direction that Red Mesa lay, 20 miles up the valley, with its weathered sign and its rebuilt fences and its double-notch cattle that had stood in the rain on a mountain road and waited. He had been homeless for 14 months. He had fixed other men's fences and carried other men's hay bales and swallowed a year's worth of humiliation in the town where he had once been respected. And he had done it while his daughter taught herself to read a loan document, and his son named barn cats. And the woman standing beside him now sent wires to livestock inspectors in the 8 minutes she said she would. He had not done any of it alone. That was the thing he had needed to be wrong about. That was the piece he had carried since Martha died, the belief that accepting help meant failing, that a man's value was measured by what he carried without assistance, that asking for a hand during hardship was the same as admitting you could not stand. He had been wrong. He could see it clearly now, standing on the courthouse steps in the evening air, with a judge's order in Hartwell's case file that said Red Mesa Ranch was his again. He had fought to reclaim what was stolen. He had done that himself, found the evidence, confronted Aldous, ridden through the rain toward a mountain pass. But he had done it while standing on ground that someone else had made steady enough to stand on. He looked at Lenora. She was watching the mountains, not him, giving him the moment without making it about her, which was, he had come to understand, one of her consistent qualities. "I owe you a great deal," he said. "You owe me fence work and cattle management," she said, still looking at the mountains. "Which you've more than delivered." She paused. "And Hartwell's fee, which I expect you to repay on a schedule, we'll agree on later." "That's not all of it." She turned and looked at him. "No," she said, "but the rest can wait until you've been back on your own land for a while." She looked at him with that directness. She had never softened for anyone's comfort, including his. "Go home, Calder. Your children have been waiting long enough." He rode north in the failing light, toward Red Mesa, toward a gate he hadn't passed through in 14 months, and the ground under the bay's hooves was solid, and the mountains were steady on either side, and ahead, just visible against the darkening sky, the outline of land that was his again. He rode through the gate alone. He stopped the horse under the old sign and looked up at it. Red Mesa Ranch. The letters were weathered but legible, and someone he would find out later, it was Torres, who had ridden up that afternoon after Calloway's ruling had been wired to Hawthorne Ridge, had replaced the rusted chain that held the sign with a new one. Calder sat his horse under that sign for a long time. He did not perform any of what he felt. There was no one there to perform it for. It was just a man and a horse and a piece of land and the weight of everything it had taken to get back to this exact spot. He thought about Martha. He let himself think about her, properly, for the first time in months, without the anger or the grief getting in the way, just the clear memory of her, sitting at the ranch table with the count books and her pencil and that small particular frown she got when a number didn't satisfy her. He thought she would have found it, and then Mara found it. He rode on through the gate, toward the dark house that was his again, and behind him the sign swung once in the evening wind and was still. Spring came to Red Mesa the way it always had, not gently, not all at once, but in arguments. A warm week followed by a late frost, mud that froze overnight and thawed by noon. Cattle restless, and the grass not yet decided about growing. Calder had forgotten how much he loved it. He had forgotten the particular sound the wind made through the timber on the north ridge, and the way the morning light came across the east pasture at an angle that made the frost look like something worth keeping. He had been away 14 months, and the land had not waited for him. It had gone on being itself, indifferent to his absence. And that indifference felt, inexplicably, like a kind of welcome. He brought Mara and Eli home on a Saturday. Mara walked through the front door of the ranch house and stood in the middle of the main room and did not speak. She looked at the walls, at the window where the light came through the same as it always had, at the corner where the shelf still held 3 of her mother's things that Pike's people apparently hadn't thought worth taking. She picked up a small ceramic pitcher from the shelf. Blue and white, the handle chipped at the base where it had been dropped years ago and glued back imperfectly. She set it back down. "It still smells like this place," she said. "Yeah," Calder said. "It does." Eli had already gone through every room and come back to report that his old bedroom was mostly intact, that someone had left a coffee tin on the kitchen table which he considered suspicious, and that the barn needed a new latch on the middle stall, but was otherwise fine. He had assessed the property with the authority of a 7-year-old who believed he had significant opinions on ranch infrastructure, and then he went to find the nearest thing to feed. Calder let him go. He stood in the main room with Mara and looked at the home he had built and lost and taken back, and he thought about all the versions of himself that had stood in this room: the young man who first bought the land, the husband, the father, the man who had stood here the morning after Martha died and not known how to make breakfast, the man who had stood here the day Pike's people came and had carried his children out under one arm each like they were cargo, moving fast, because if he slowed down, he would not be able to move at all. "Papa," Mara said. "Yeah, are we going to be all right now?" He looked at his daughter, 11 years old, with her mother's precision and her father's stubbornness, and a mind that had saved his ranch from a box under a cottage bed. "We're going to be better than all right," he said. "But it's going to take work." She looked at him with the expression that meant she found this answer both accurate and mildly insufficient. "Mrs. Ashcombe," she said carefully, "are we going to see her still?" Calder was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. Mara looked at the shelf with the ceramic pitcher. "Good," she said, and went to start on the kitchen. He rode to Hawthorne Ridge that evening, carrying nothing except the original key to Red Mesa's front door, which he had kept in his coat pocket through 14 months and 2 states of being, and had held in his hand on the darkest nights without knowing exactly why. Lenora answered the door in her work coat, which he had come to understand was her default state at this hour, and she looked at him and at his empty hands and waited. He held up the key. "I kept this the whole time," he said. "I don't know if I kept it because I believed I'd get back or because I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. Probably both." He looked at her. "I've been thinking about what I want to say to you, and I keep coming up with something long and careful, and it doesn't sound like me, so I'm going to say the short version." Lenora waited. She was good at waiting. "When I came to Silver Crossing, I had 2 children, and a broken wagon and a year's worth of grief I hadn't finished carrying," he said. "I was not a good prospect by any reasonable measure. You gave me wages and a cottage and talked to my daughter like she was worth talking to, and you never once made me feel like I owed you something I couldn't pay." He paused. "My ranch is back. My debts are clear. I have nothing left to prove to this valley or to myself. So I can ask you this the way I wanted to ask it from the beginning, as one person to another. Not because I need rescuing, and not because you need a project." She was looking at him with those steady eyes that had never once flinched from whatever was in front of them. "I'm asking," he said, "because I don't want to do the next part of this alone. And the only person I've met in a long time who makes alone feel like an actual loss is you." The wind moved between them across the Hawthorne Ridge porch. Lenora looked at the key in his hand, then at his face. "You rehearsed that," she said. "Twice," he admitted. Something crossed her face that was not quite a smile and was entirely genuine. "Yes," she said. He did not ask her to clarify what she was saying yes to. He understood. She was not a woman who said things she did not mean, and she was not a woman who needed the question repeated. They married in July, under the cottonwood trees that grew along the property line between Red Mesa and Hawthorne Ridge, which felt like the right place, not on his land, not on hers, but in the space between them where they had been building something without either of them having a good word for it yet. Mara stood beside Lenora and did not cry, which was consistent with who she was, although afterward Torres observed that her eyes had done something interesting during the vows, and he said this to Eli, who said he had definitely not cried either. And Torres said no, of course not, and let that be the end of it. They did not sell either ranch. They ran them together as one operation: cattle on Red Mesa, horses and breeding stock at Hawthorne Ridge, which created a combined enterprise that was larger and more stable than either had been alone, and which required both of them fully, which suited both of them exactly. The work was not easy. The first summer they disagreed about grazing rotation twice, about the purchase of a new bull once, and about the management of Hawthorne Ridge's breeding records in a way that lasted 4 days before Mara, who had appointed herself the ranch's de facto accountant at age 12, solved the argument by producing a ledger system that incorporated both of their approaches and was demonstrably better than either. Calder had looked at the ledger and then at Lenora. "She's going to run this place someday," he said. "She's running it now," Lenora said. "We're just taller." He could not argue with that. Pike lost everything the following spring when the Territorial Banking Commission completed its review and 3 additional ranchers came forward with documented discrepancies. The civil judgments against him exceeded his assets. He left Wyoming Territory before the final hearings, and no one in Silver Crossing seemed to know where he went, and no one asked very hard. Aldous resigned from the bank. He was not prosecuted. Hartwell had negotiated this as part of the conditions of his cooperation, which Calder had not been entirely comfortable with and had accepted anyway, because Aldous had given them the original document, and that document had made the case, and some debts were paid in ways that were not satisfying but were accurate. Aldous moved his family to somewhere south. The bank appointed a new manager who had no relationship with any party in the affair and who had the particular quality of total blankness that suggested he intended to keep it that way. The foreman's cottage at Hawthorne Ridge stayed as it was. Lenora had offered to convert it for other use, and Calder had said quietly that he would rather leave it, and she had understood without asking him to explain. His children had spent their worst months in that cottage and had come out of it intact, and places where hard things happen and you survive them deserve to be remembered. Sometimes in the evenings Eli would go sit on its step with Marshall the cat, who had made the transition to Red Mesa with the philosophical adaptability of an animal who understood that his primary requirement was warmth, and that the source of warmth was negotiable. Calder would watch him from across the yard and think about the particular arithmetic of hard times, the way they take things from you that cannot be replaced, and give you things in return that you would not have found any other way. He did not think this made hard times good. He did not believe in that arithmetic, the kind that says suffering is secretly a gift. Losing Martha was not a gift. Losing Red Mesa was not a gift. Carrying 2 frightened children through a Wyoming winter in a wagon was not a gift. But the people you find when you are standing with nothing, the ones who see you clearly and stay anyway, those are real. Those are yours. And you would not have known them without the hard road, which is a different thing from saying the hard road was worth it. It is simply the truth of how it happened. Mara grew up to run the ranch books with a precision that made Hartwell, when he visited on legal business, look at her with the quiet respect of a professional encountering another professional. She had her mother's instinct for numbers and her father's refusal to accept a figure that didn't sit right. And the combination made her formidable in ways that the ranchers and buyers, who underestimated her, came to understand at some cost to themselves. Eli became a horseman, as he had promised himself he would on the day Lenora put him on a gentle mare in a paddock and let him hold the reins. He was patient with difficult animals and instinctive in the way of someone who had spent his childhood paying attention, and Lenora taught him everything she knew, which was considerable. And then he went further on his own, which was how it was supposed to work. And Calder kept working. He worked the land he had built and lost and reclaimed. He worked it alongside a woman who had never needed saving and had given him steady ground to stand on anyway. And he understood that those 2 things were not in contradiction, that needing no rescue and offering a hand are simply what decent people do when they see someone fighting to get back where they belong. The lesson, if there was one, was not complicated. It was just hard to learn. A man is not diminished by what he cannot do alone. He is only diminished by refusing the hand that is offered honestly, out of a pride so rigid it cannot tell the difference between independence and isolation. Calder had been guilty of that pride. He had worn it like armor for 14 months, and it had cost him cold nights and hard mornings, and the particular loneliness of someone who believes asking for help is the same as failing. He had been wrong about that. He knew it now, standing on his own land in the Wyoming spring with his children, and the woman he had married, and the mountains the same as they had always been. Some things you fight for alone. Some things you fight for better with someone beside you. Red Mesa gave him his land back. The rest, the part that made the land worth returning to, that had been Lenora, and Mara's careful handwriting, and Torres's quiet steadiness, and an orange cat named Marshall who had decided that wherever Eli went was home. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.